The pill tray left her hand before anyone could draw a breath. It struck the marble floor of Holloway House, bounced once, and split apart. 12 white tablets scattered in 8 directions, rolling past the feet of the assembled guests like small pale bones. Pick them up. Now Celeste Ashford's voice climbed to the vaulted ceiling and fell back down against all 4 walls, as though the house itself had just been struck across the face. Beyond the windows, the Atlantic broke against the base of the cliff. Once, twice, then nothing. Pick them up, you hired help. 8 guests stood frozen. No one bent down, no one moved. At the top of the staircase in shadow, an old man sat in a wheelchair. His left hand closed around the armrest until the knuckles went white. His right hand no longer closed around anything. For 8 months he had not spoken a single word. He had never, in all that time, wanted so badly to shout, Meredith Vale. 28 years old, stood in the center of the great hall. Her white apron rose gently over 7 months of pregnancy. She looked down at the tablets scattered across the floor, the tablets she carried upstairs to the man above, every day, at 4 o'clock exactly, for 7 long months. Then she raised her eyes to the woman who had thrown them. She did not step back. She laid one hand flat against her own chest, and she spoke 5 words. Those 5 words would cut that afternoon cleanly in half the part before and the part after. 5 words that made the blonde woman blink twice, as though hearing a language no one had ever taught her. 5 words that predicted the arrival of the man crossing the threshold later that day, the man who, before the night was over, would take back 3 warehouses with nothing but a dinner napkin folded into quarters. The man whose name the entire eastern seaboard spoke only in a lowered voice. August Holloway was 34 years old. He had never once wept in front of another human being, but before the next dawn he would. Yet no one in that room knew this. 7 months earlier, the trembling hands standing in the middle of that hall had saved a 6-year-old boy from a number written wrong on a hospital screen, and the woman whose signature sat beneath that number was standing exactly 3 steps away. She did not remember Meredith's face. If this story reached something in you, leave a like, share it with the person you thought of while listening, and subscribe to our channel, so you don't miss the story that comes next. Celeste Ashford stepped forward. Her heels struck the marble in 3 slow beats, like someone counting her steps before delivering a blow. She stopped exactly an arm's length from Meredith Vale, close enough for the scent of her expensive perfume to overwhelm the smell of antiseptic still clinging to the nurse's sleeve. On the small table against the wall, 3 crystal glasses lightly touched one another and gave off a thin, delicate chime. Who do you think you are in this house? Celeste lowered her voice, but all 8 guests heard every word clearly. That was precisely what she wanted. Do you think that belly gives you the right to stand up straight in front of me? Meredith didn't answer. You don't even know who the father is, Celeste said, and corner of her mouth lifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, as though she had just laid a card on the table that she had been holding for a very long time. People like you are always the same. You come to work in someone else's house carrying a child, then wait for someone to feel sorry for you. An older woman among the guests raised a hand to her chest. She said nothing. She only looked down at the floor, where 12 white pills were still scattered among the expensive shoes, and drew 1 foot back slightly, as though afraid she might step on one. The grandfather clock in the corner of the great hall continued marking the seconds. Tick, tock, tick, tock. In that silence, the sound grew so loud it became unbearable. Meredith bent down. Everyone thought she was going to pick up the pills. She didn't. She placed the dented aluminum tray carefully on the stone floor, the way someone might set down an object that could still be useful. Then she straightened. She folded the hand towel from her shoulder in half, then in quarters, and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. Her fingers didn't tremble. Those were hands that had once held a needle in an emergency room at 3 o'clock in the morning, while the ambulance sirens outside had not yet fallen completely silent. She didn't shout. She didn't step back. She didn't defend herself. She placed one hand against her chest, directly over the place where her heart was beating, and she spoke. He can't buy this place. 5 words, so softly spoken that the person standing farthest away had to lean forward. Then she corrected herself quietly, almost as though speaking only to herself. You, Celeste. Then once again, there was no anger on her face, only a brief emptiness. The expression of someone who had just heard a language no one had ever taught her and didn't know which language to use in reply. What did you just say? I said you can't buy this place. Meredith kept her hand against her chest. Her voice remained steady, never rising by so much as a single note. You can humiliate me in front of 8 people. You can make me crawl across the floor and pick up every pill. You can throw me out through those gates before nightfall, and I'll go. That is what I am paid to endure. She lowered her hand. But there is one place in here that your voice cannot enter. That place doesn't belong to you. It belongs to my mother. In that moment, the grandfather clock seemed to lose a beat. One of the 3 crystal glasses on the side table swayed gently, touched the glass beside it, then became still. One of the 8 guests, the young man standing closest to the window, slowly slipped both hands into his coat pockets and didn't take them out again. At the top of the staircase, hidden in shadow, the old man's left hand loosened its grip on the arm of his wheelchair, then tightened again, then loosened, 3 times, like a man trying to speak without a mouth. Celeste laughed. The sound escaped her throat before she had time to arrange it properly, and it didn't sound like laughter. Your mother, she repeated. Of course. Some woman, I suppose. Probably cleaned houses for someone too. Gave birth to a fatherless daughter, too. Then died in some hospital room where no one even remembered her name. On the wall, the enormous mirror reflected both women. One dressed in silk, one dressed in an apron. Something in the air shifted. Meredith didn't move forward. She didn't clench her hands. She didn't grind her teeth. But when she spoke, her voice had changed, and everyone in the great hall recognized it at the same moment, including Celeste, including the old man above them, including the clock, which seemed to hesitate before marking the next second. Don't speak about her. The word don't fell onto the marble floor like a soft pebble. It made no echo. It carried none of the weight of metal. But it remained there, among the 12 white pills, and no one dared step across it. Please don't speak about her again. Celeste opened her mouth, then closed it. At that exact moment, the great doors of Holloway House opened. The afternoon light from beyond the cliffs poured inside, cutting a long path across the floor, passing over the scattered pills, and stopping precisely where Meredith stood. August Holloway entered, his tie loosened, and his coat draped over one arm. In his leather-gloved hand was a small square velvet box, still unopened. He stopped in the middle of the doorway. He looked down at the floor of his house. The change that passed over Celeste Ashford's face happened so quickly that no one saw it take place. They saw only the result. Half a second earlier, her cheeks had still been flushed red with anger. Half a second later, they had changed to an entirely different shade of pink, softer, more tremulous, the color of someone who had just been wounded. Her shoulders, which had been straight as a ruler, suddenly collapsed. Her chin quivered slightly, and tears rose into her eyes in precisely the necessary amount, no more than a single drop, gathering at the corner of one eye as though waiting for the light to strike it at the most flattering angle. Those weren't the tears of someone who had just begun to cry. They were the tears of someone who had practiced crying many times in front of a mirror until she had mastered it. "Darling," she said, and her voice was now as sweet as honey pouring from a jar. "You're home. Look at what she just said to me, in front of your guests. Right here in the middle of your house." She took one step toward August Holloway. Both hands extended before her, all 10 fingers spread wide as though she had just dropped something precious. "This woman cannot remain here for one more night." August didn't look at her. He remained standing in the doorway, the small velvet box resting neatly in his leather-gloved palm. He didn't look at Celeste. He didn't look at the 8 guests, standing rooted to the floor of the great hall. He didn't look at Meredith Vale. He looked down at the floor. His gaze moved slowly across the marble, from the foot of the staircase to the legs of the side table, then circled back again. He looked at the white pills scattered among the expensive shoes. One had rolled close to the toe of the woman wearing the pearl necklace and stopped there. 2 lay side by side beneath the table. One had rolled farthest of all the way to the western wall, where the afternoon light couldn't reach it. He counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. No one in the great hall knew what he was doing. They saw only the man standing motionless with his eyes lowered, and they assumed he was restraining his anger. The grandfather clock continued marking the seconds. Outside, the Atlantic waves struck the base of the cliffs with steady indifference. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The young man standing near the window pulled one hand from his coat pocket, then slipped it back inside. 10, 11. August's gaze stopped on the final pill, the one lying against the western wall. 12. He knew that number exactly. He knew the 3 ivory white pills were anticoagulants. He knew the 2 smallest ones had to be taken after a meal and mustn't be swallowed on an empty stomach. He knew the oval pill was the one that had to be crushed because the person taking it could no longer swallow. He knew all of this because 321 mornings earlier, he had been the one sitting in the doctor's office, listening as each medication name, each dosage, and each scheduled hour was read aloud, and he had written everything down on the back of a business card. He still carried that business card in his wallet. "Darling," Celeste said again, and something uncertain had begun to enter her voice. "Are you listening to me?" August raised his head. He didn't look at her. He looked toward the top of the staircase, into the darkness, where a figure sat motionless in a wheelchair. The 2 men looked at each other across the space between them for 3 beats of the clock. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Then August turned back. He placed the small velvet box on the side table, beside the 3 crystal glasses, carefully, as though the box itself bore no blame for any of this, and he spoke very softly, no louder than the waves outside. "This isn't your home yet, Celeste." The words left his mouth before he had time to think. They didn't sound like a rebuke. They sounded like a truth that had been sitting silently inside his chest for many years, waiting for an opening, and had finally found its way out. Celeste stood frozen in the middle of the great hall. The tear she had prepared still rested at the corner of her eye, neither falling nor retreating, no longer knowing where it was supposed to go. The 8 guests began to leave. No one said goodbye. The woman wearing the pearl necklace stepped carefully around the pill near the toe of her shoe, as though avoiding a puddle. The young man by the window was the last to go, and before crossing the threshold, he glanced back at Meredith Vale once, a very quick look, then lowered his head and walked out. The great door closed. The afternoon light was cut off. Only 3 people remained in the great hall, and a 4th sat in darkness at the top of the staircase. The old man's left hand slowly loosened its grip on the arm of the wheelchair. His knuckles, white with strain, gradually returned to the color of his skin. He leaned his head back against the chair and closed his eyes. For 8 months, he hadn't spoken a single word. That afternoon, for the first time, he felt no need to speak. At 7 o'clock that evening, the chandelier in the dining room was dimmed by half, and candles were lit in its place. 12 seats, 12 sets of silverware, arranged at precisely measured intervals, the ends of the handles exactly 1 finger joint from the edge of the table. That was how the table at Holloway House had been set for 36 years, and the man who had taught the maids how to do it was now lying on the 3rd floor, unable to swallow solid food. August Holloway sat at the head of the table. Celeste sat to his right, an emerald necklace around her throat, smiling at everyone as though the events of that afternoon had never happened. At the far end of the table sat Rennick Vaughn, 51 years old, owner of 3 warehouses in the South, a man who had a habit of speaking more loudly than necessary, because he believed volume was proof of confidence. He had already drunk 3 glasses of wine before the main course. He was telling a story, and he knew the entire table was listening. "Honestly," Rennick Vaughn said, turning his wineglass slowly in his hand, "I still can't understand it. This whole building has more than 20 rooms, yet the finest one, the room with windows looking straight out over the bay, is given to a paralyzed old man, a man who doesn't even know where he is." There was a very brief moment, no longer than half a heartbeat before the laughter began. Then the entire table laughed. The woman beside Rennick Vaughn laughed, and raised a hand to cover her mouth. The man across from him laughed and tapped 1 finger against the tablecloth. Celeste laughed, tipping her head slightly back, the white curve of her throat exposed beneath the candlelight. And August Holloway laughed as well. He laughed very softly, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough, while his eyes remained lowered toward his plate. He finished cutting the final piece of meat. He chewed, he swallowed. Then he set down his knife with the blade turned inward, exactly as he had been taught. He lifted the linen napkin, wiped the left corner of his mouth, then the right. Then he placed the napkin on the table and folded it, once in half, then into quarters. He smoothed the creases with 2 gloved fingers. The laughter in the dining room slowly faded, though no one knew why. "Rennick," August said. His voice was ordinary. It didn't rise by so much as a single note. That was precisely what made 7 people in the room suddenly straighten in their chairs. "Yes, Mr. Holloway. Count for me." From 1 to 30, Rennick Vaughn laughed, a short laugh, waiting for what would come next, waiting for an explanation, waiting for a friendly hand on his shoulder. Nothing came. I'm sorry. I don't understand, Count. The man looked around the table. No one looked back at him. The woman beside him had set down her fork. The candle flickered once, then stood straight again. 1, Rennick Vaughn said. His voice was still intact. 2, 3. No one continued eating. 4, 5, 6. August Holloway sat motionless, both hands resting on the table on either side of the napkin folded into quarters. He didn't look at Rennick Vaughn. He looked at the candle in the center of the table. 7, 8, 9, 10. By the time he reached 12, the rhythm of the counting had begun to slow. Rennick Vaughn realized that 30 was a very large number when a man had to count to it in silence beneath candlelight before 11 people who didn't dare breathe. 13, 14, he swallowed. 15, his voice trembled on the word 15, 16. 17, a very faint sound came from the direction of the staircase. No one in the dining room heard it. 18, 19, 20. At the top of the stairs, Meredith Vale stopped. In her hands was a new tray, a wooden one, and on it were 12 fresh pills, counted again from the beginning, and poured again from the beginning, because the original 12 had lain on the great hall floor all afternoon. She meant to continue walking. She didn't. 21, Rennick Vaughn stopped. His shoulders had begun to shake. 22, he was crying, silently. The tears simply ran down his face and he didn't wipe them away, because wiping them away would mean admitting they were there. 23, 24, 25. The 3 candles in the middle of the table burned steadily. No one moved. 26, 27, 28, 29. He paused for a long time before the final number. 30, August Holloway nodded once. Thank you, he continued, looking at the candle. 30 seconds. That is the amount of your life you just used. He slowly pushed his chair back a little. The man on the 3rd floor whom you just mentioned is named Thaddeus Crow. Every morning, he wakes and wants a drink of water. The glass is placed 2 handspans beyond his reach. He has to twist the half of his body that can still move in order to reach it. That takes him 30 seconds. No one in the dining room hailed. I timed him. For 321 mornings he stood. He fastened the button of his suit jacket. You have just used 30 seconds of your own life to understand 30 seconds of his. Now you may go home. Rennick Vaughn opened his mouth. No sound emerged. The 3 warehouses in the south will have a new owner tomorrow morning. My people will contact your attorney before 8 o'clock. At the far end of the dining room, 2 men in black suits were already standing on either side of the door, though no one knew when they had arrived. They didn't step forward. They didn't extend their hands. They simply stood there, and Rennick Vaughn rose from his chair on his own, walked the length of the room on his own, and crossed the threshold on his own. No one touched anyone. The door closed very softly. At the top of the staircase, Meredith Vale stood motionless with the wooden tray in her hands. She had seen everything. She didn't smile. At the head of the table below, Celeste Ashford lifted her wineglass toward August, and she smiled at him, a warm, admiring smile, almost tender. She loved this moment at 5 o'clock in the morning. The fog over the bay had not yet lifted, and cold storage warehouse number 7 stood at the far end of the pier, where sodium lamps cast a dirty orange light across the wet concrete. August Holloway arrived alone. He brought no one with him. People said that was the most frightening thing about him, that when he needed to bring men along, the matter was not yet serious, and when he came alone, everything had already been decided. Inside the warehouse, the cold rose in white streams every time he breathed out. The shipment sat in the middle of the floor, foam crates stacked one upon another, bits of crushed ice still clinging to the lids. 4 crates had been opened. Beneath the frozen fish were 4 square bundles wrapped in plastic, compressed tight by machine. The warehouse supervisor's name was Dorsey. He had been standing there for 40 minutes waiting. When August Holloway crossed the threshold, Dorsey dropped to his knees before August could say a single word. August said nothing at all. He looked at the 4 bundles. Then he removed his gloves. At 6 o'clock in the morning, he sat in the car with the window lowered halfway. The sun had not yet fully risen above the horizon. It had only cast a silver-gray streak across the far end of the bay. He was putting his gloves back on, 1 finger at a time, slowly, like a man putting on a coat he had taken off to do some work around the house. There was a fresh scratch across the back of his right hand, about 2 finger joints long, still pink. He pulled the leather over it. The driver stood outside with his hands clasped behind his back, not looking into the car. "Burn the shipment," August said. "The entire warehouse. Insurance will pay." "Yes, sir." There was a pause. "And the man, sir?" August looked out at the sea. He looked for a very long time. The early morning ferry was leaving the dock on the far side of the bay, dragging behind it a trail of white foam that slowly closed again. "A bus to Florida," he said. "And an envelope." The driver nodded. "He has 3 children." In the northeastern harbor, no one wrote down August Holloway's 3 rules. There was no sheet of paper. No one read them aloud during meetings. But from Providence down to New Bedford, everyone who worked on the docks knew those 3 rules by heart, as well as they knew the names of their own children. "No drugs through my harbor. No women. No children. No one touches my people." Cold storage warehouse number 7 had broken the first rule. And people said Mr. Holloway never killed anyone out of anger. He simply closed a door, and the person standing on the wrong side of it would never open it again. That same day, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Meredith Vale pushed Thaddeus Crow's wheelchair out of the 4th floor elevator at St. Mercy Hospital. She had walked this corridor thousands of times. She knew the 11th tile from the elevator had a thin crack running through it. She knew the vending machine in the corner often swallowed coins. She knew the smell of the 4th floor, the smell of alcohol and printer paper, and something faintly sweet that no one could name. She had not set foot here in 7 months. For 7 months, she had gone around this building every time she took the bus home. My Thaddeus Crow sat still. His left hand rested on his thigh, his fingers slightly curled. Ward Price stepped out of room 412. He was 37 years old, wearing a white coat, a stethoscope hanging behind his neck, and a name badge that identified him as chief resident. He stopped in the middle of the corridor. He didn't look at her face first. He looked down at the swell beneath her coat, and over the course of 3 seconds, 3 different things passed across his face. First came confusion. Then calculation, very quick, the reflex of a man accustomed to working with dates and numbers. Then something closed behind his eyes, like a trapdoor falling shut. He understood immediately what it was. He was the only person in the world who could understand in just 3 seconds. "You kept it," he said. Meredith didn't stop right away. She pushed the wheelchair 2 more steps before stopping. 3 years, she said. She didn't turn around. She looked straight toward the far end of the corridor, where there was a window, and beyond the window was a pale, milky patch of July sky. "Meredith." She pushed the chair forward again. The wheel rolled over the cracked tile and made a small sound. Then she stopped once more, still without turning around. "Do you know what the worst part is?" she said. Her voice was perfectly ordinary, as though she were reading back a note from a medical chart. "It isn't that you left me. I can understand that. People leave each other for many reasons, and there are reasons no one deserves to be blamed for." Thaddeus Crow's left hand moved slightly on his thigh. "The worst part is that every month, when I transferred $214 to that cold room, I still sat in front of the screen for a few seconds after pressing the button. 3 years, 36 times. And every single time, I thought that if you were still here, maybe we would be making the transfer together." She left. Ward Price remained alone in the middle of the 4th floor corridor. Light from the window at the far end poured across the floor, and his shadow stretched behind him, lying across the cracked tile. He stood there for a very long time. Then he slipped a hand into the pocket of his white coat and took out his phone. He looked at the screen. He dialed a number. The bus home crossed 3 bridges, and Meredith Vale always sat by the window on the right so she could look out over the bay. That afternoon, she didn't look at the bay. She looked at her 2 hands resting in her lap, and she let memory do what it always did whenever she was too tired to summon the strength to stop it. When she was 25, an endocrinologist on the 6th floor of the very hospital she had just left placed 2 fingers against her throat and told her to swallow. He asked her to swallow a second time. Then he sat down, and he said nothing for longer than was necessary. Thyroid cancer. The words didn't sound as frightening as some of the other words in the same family, and every doctor told her the prognosis was good, that people lived a very long time with this disease, that she was young. But before chemotherapy began, they asked her a question, one every hospital asked, one included in the standard procedure, printed on a form beside a square box waiting to be checked. Did she want to preserve embryos? Ward Price was only 30 then. With no stethoscope draped behind his neck and no title printed on a badge, and he sat beside her in the small room with a poster about the life cycle of a cell taped to the wall. He held her hand. Together, they checked that box. It was an afternoon in October, and they laughed on the way home because they both believed it was only a precaution on a piece of paper. A box checked for a future they were certain they would never need. Chemotherapy ended. Her hair grew back, coarser than before, curling at the roots. Her numbers returned to the normal range. She went back to the emergency room, back to the night shift, and she did the work better than anyone else there, because someone who had once lain on a stretcher understood what a person on a stretcher needed. Then she became pregnant. Naturally. No one had expected it. Her doctor told her that sometimes the human body did things medicine could only stand by and document. In the 23rd week, her body could no longer hold on. They explained it to her using the same words she herself used when explaining things to her patients. The old tumor had left her endocrine system more fragile than normal. Her hormones had fluctuated. There had been no warning, no symptom she had overlooked, no injection she should have received, no appointment she should have kept. No one did anything wrong, the doctor told her, and he said it in the gentlest voice he possessed because he believed it was a comfort. It was the worst thing Meredith Vale had ever heard in her life, because if no one had done anything wrong, then there was no one to be angry with. And a 25-year-old woman lying in a hospital bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, staring wide-eyed at the ceiling, needed something to be angry with. She needed a name. She needed a face. She needed someone she could hate for the rest of her life and, through that hatred, keep herself alive. They hadn't given her that. They had only handed her discharge papers and a paper bag containing her clothes. She hadn't even had time to give it a name. Ward Price left 6 months later, not because of her hair, not because of the nights she vomited yellow bile into the bathroom sink. He stayed through all of that. He left because every night, when the lights went out, she lay facing the wall without saying a word, and he lay behind her, looking at the back of her neck, until he understood that the woman she had been wasn't coming back. Before he left, he said a sentence he had surely practiced beforehand. "You died with the baby girl," and he was right. That was the worst part of it, 3 years. $214 every month, transferred into the account of a storage facility outside Providence, where a row of steel tanks stood motionless in a cold room she had never entered. 36 payments. Not one was ever late. There were months when she ate instant noodles for 3 weeks straight. There was one winter when she never turned on the heat. But on the 5th day of every month, she sat in front of the screen, pressed the button, then remained there for a few more seconds. Then the letter came. It lay between a pizza advertisement and the electric bill. The storage facility announced that it was closing and merging with a larger system in another state. All unused embryos would be disposed of according to regulations after 90 days unless the client transferred them elsewhere or proceeded with implantation. Transfer elsewhere, $8,000. Implantation, $4,200. At the time, she had $4,600 in her account. Every dollar of it had come from the condolence money given at her mother's funeral. She sat with that letter for 3 weeks. She read it at different hours of the day, as though the numbers might change if the light changed. Then, on a Tuesday morning, she put on the only decent coat she still owned, took a bus to the outskirts of the city, and signed wherever they told her to sign. She told no one. There was no one to tell. At 9 o'clock that evening, Meredith Vale knocked on the study door. She had helped Thaddeus Crow into bed, taken his blood pressure, written the number in the small notebook she kept on the windowsill, turned off the main light, and switched on the egg-shaped night lamp he liked. Then she went downstairs, and one of the servants told her Mr. Halloway wished to see her. The study at Halloway House was in the east wing, beyond 2 sets of doors. The room smelled of old wood, walnut that had stood for 40 years in a room where the windows were rarely opened, mingled with paper, and the faint trace of tobacco smoke from the days when some man had still smoked cigars there. The velvet curtains were partly drawn. A strip of lamplight fell across the center of the rug, as though the house itself had already chosen the place where whatever came next was meant to happen. August Halloway stood beside the arched window, with his back turned. "Please sit. I'm comfortable standing, sir." He didn't insist. He walked to the nearest leather armchair and placed both hands on its back, but he didn't sit down. He was still wearing his gloves. "I reviewed the payroll this morning," he said. How long have you worked here? 7 months, sir. He looked at her, not the way an employer looked at a servant, the way a man looked when he had just heard a number far more precise than the question required. Where were you born, Miss Vale? She hesitated. In a small town. You probably haven't heard of it, tell me. The small clock on the mantel continued counting the seconds. Coldbrook, she said. Coldbrook, New Hampshire. August Holloway straightened. He moved too quickly, faster than a 34-year-old man needed to move, and one of his hands accidentally struck the brass paperweight on the desk. It turned halfway around, then stopped. Say that again, Coldbrook. Up north, near the river. Fewer than 2,000 people live there. He walked toward the window, then turned back, then walked toward the window again, and Meredith realized that the man's legs were no longer entirely obeying him. My father was born in Coldbrook, he said. She didn't look surprised. She only gave a small nod, so slight it seemed she had known it already, or as though she had just heard a distant door close somewhere far away. He lived there until he was 9, August continued, speaking more to himself than to her. My grandfather died young. My grandmother brought him to the city. They lived in a room above a bakery for 7 years until he found work loading freight at the docks. That dock was the beginning of all of this house, this name. He sat on the edge of the armchair as though his legs could no longer hold him. Why did you come to this city? My mother was ill. She laced her 10 fingers together in front of her stomach. There wasn't a proper hospital in Coldbrook. I brought her here. We rented a room on the west side. I took any work people would give me. Until she died, I'm sorry. Thank you, sir. How long after that did you come to work here? Not long. The employment agency must have given you several choices. 4 choices, sir. Why did you choose this house? The silence stretched on. Outside, waves struck the base of the cliffs, slow and steady. Meredith looked down at an indistinct point on the rug. Because my mother told me I had to come. Inside the study, the small clock on the mantel suddenly seemed very loud. Could you say that again? Before she died, she held my hand and told me that when she was gone, I was to apply for work at Holloway House. The Holloway House on the cliffs, not any other house. This one, her voice remained even. She told me not to ask anyone anything, not to tell anyone who I was. Just come inside, do my work, and wait. Wait for what? I asked her that, sir. I asked her many times, over many days. What did she say? She said I would know. August Holloway remained still. He asked nothing else for long enough that the fire in the hearth changed color once. Did she ever mention my family? Never. A name? A photograph. My mother took nearly everything with her to the grave, sir. She paused. She left me only 2 things. What 2 things? A sentence and an envelope. He rose from the edge of the chair. What sentence? Meredith Vale lifted her head. For the first time during the entire conversation, she looked directly into the eyes of the man standing before her. Forgive your mother. August Holloway's gloved hand tightened around the back of the leather chair. And the envelope? She told me never to open it. Only to give it to the right person when I knew who that person was. Do you know now? No, sir. He looked at her for a long time. What does the envelope look like? She hesitated for the 3rd time that night, and this time longest of all. Thick cream-colored paper, no stamp, no address. On the front directly in the center, there is a drawing, a compass. 8 points. She raised one hand and traced it in the air with a finger. There is a letter in the center. Which letter? Outside the window, waves struck the cliffs. The letter H, sir. The brass paperweight on the desk turned another quarter of the way around, then stopped. My mother drew it herself, Meredith said, with her left hand. Her right hand could no longer move by then. August Holloway sat down. He lowered himself very slowly, one bone at a time, like a man finally setting down a burden he had carried for 30 years without ever knowing its name. The 8-pointed compass with the letter H in the center was Cassius Holloway's private seal. The old man had first drawn it at 19, on a letter he never sent. He used it for the rest of his life, and August had believed it had died with his father. Meredith Vale went up to the 3rd floor to retrieve the envelope. It lay at the bottom of her cloth suitcase, wrapped in a worn handkerchief and tied with a piece of hemp cord her mother had knotted with her own hands. She carried it downstairs, crossing the great hall where someone had long since swept away the scattered pills, and when she opened the study door, August Holloway was still sitting in the leather armchair with both hands resting on his thighs. He had removed his gloves. That was the first thing she noticed. His hands were covered in scars, old scars layered over scars even older, and across the back of his right hand was a scratch that was still pink. She placed the handkerchief bundle on the desk, untied the cord, and pushed the cream-colored envelope toward him. The 8-pointed compass sat in the exact center of the paper, its ink faded, the lines trembling slightly at the end of each point, like the work of someone learning to write with the wrong hand. August looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he extended one finger, placed it over the letter H in the center, and kept it there long enough for the desk lamp to make a faint clicking sound as the filament expanded in the heat. "You've never opened it." "Never, sir." "She told you to give it to the right person." "Yes." "Do you think I'm that person?" Meredith didn't answer. She sat in the leather chair across from him, her knees pressed together, her hands clasped over her stomach. August Holloway picked up the envelope. He slipped his thumb beneath the edge of the paper, brittle with age, and pulled it apart. The paper tore along an uneven line. The first thing that fell out wasn't a letter. It was a Polaroid photograph, its white border yellowed to ivory, a thin crack running diagonally across one lower corner. It fell face up onto the walnut desk. August turned it over. A young woman sat on a stone step wearing a cotton dress barefoot, her hair tied loosely behind her. She was laughing, not at the camera, but because of something that had happened just before someone pressed the shutter. Her right hand rested on the shoulder of the man sitting one step below her. The man wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his hair combed back, and he wasn't looking at the camera, he was looking up at her. "Is this your mother?" Meredith leaned forward. She had never seen the photograph in her life. "Yes, that is my mother. And the man? I don't know who he is, sir." August turned the photograph over. On the back, written in pencil in the slanting hand of another era, the letters joined together in a way people no longer wrote. "For my Rosalind forever, Cassius." August Holloway's ungloved hand began to tremble. He placed the photograph face down, as though leaving it exposed any longer would be an act of cruelty toward the people inside it. Then he removed 3 thin sheets of paper from the envelope. He unfolded the first. He didn't read it aloud. He bent over it, his eyes moving from left to right, from the top of the page to the bottom, while Meredith sat silently watching his face. She saw his jaw tighten halfway down the page. She saw him read one line a second time, then a third. She saw his index finger press against the paper, as though the words might run away. When he finished, he folded the sheet along its original creases and placed it to his left. Then he sat upright, drew a breath in through his nose and held it. He loved her, he said. Nothing more. He opened the second sheet. The handwriting on this one was no longer as steady as it had been on the first. The lines slanted downward near the bottom of the page, as though the hand that wrote them had been fighting against something. This time, he read aloud. His voice was low and even, and he didn't pause for breath where he should have. "Rosalind, I know the child is mine. Don't look for me. Don't write to me. Don't come to the city. I'll send money through someone I trust. You won't lack for anything. The child won't lack for anything. But for God's sake, Rosalind, don't let anyone know. Don't let anyone know until I find a way. I'm asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to forgive me 1,000 times." August placed the letter on the desk. Meredith Vale had stopped breathing, though she didn't know when. "Sir." Her voice was so faint that even she could barely hear it. "Please tell me I've misunderstood." He said nothing. He only opened the third sheet, and that was the one that made him rise from the chair. He read it standing, his back turned toward her, his face directed toward the arched window, where there was nothing beyond the glass but darkness and the sound of the waves. His shoulders didn't shake. He made no sound. But he read very slowly, and when he reached a place near the bottom of the page, he lifted his left hand to cover his mouth and kept it there until he had finished. Then he folded the paper. He placed it on top of the other 2. "The baby was ill," he said. He asked someone to find a doctor and send him to Coldbrook. The letter ends there. What happened after that? There is nothing after that. He turned around. There is no 4th letter. There was still one thing left inside the envelope. August turned it upside down over the desk. A small object fell out, slid across the wood, and stopped near the edge. It was a faded piece of parchment, a handwritten birth certificate signed by a midwife, born to Rosalind Vale. Male child. 3:14 in the morning. Witnessed by Orla Bennington. Meredith Vale sat in the leather chair, and her hands were trembling so violently that she had to press them tightly together. The man standing across the desk was her brother. And somewhere in this world, or nowhere any longer, there was another man, born at 3:14 in the morning, carrying the blood of both of them in his veins. A brother she had never known she had. At midnight, Meredith Vale climbed to the 3rd floor. She couldn't remember how she had left the study, couldn't remember whether she had crossed the great hall or taken the rear staircase. In her hand was the cream-colored envelope, and inside it, wrapped again as before, were the Polaroid photograph, the 3 letters, and the yellowed plastic wristband. She opened the door to Thaddeus Crow's room, and the familiar smell met her, the scent of ointment and clean bed linens, and a trace of sea air slipping through the narrow opening in the window. The egg-shaped lamp was still glowing. He wasn't asleep. For 7 months he had never fallen asleep before she came upstairs. She pulled the wooden chair close to the side of the bed, sat down, placed both hands on her knees, and remained silent for a long while before speaking, because it took that long for her to believe her voice wouldn't break. During her first week, they had told her that this man could no longer speak. A doctor at St. Mercy had written 3 lines in his chart and underlined the last one. No possibility of language recovery. They had also told her that he understood very little, that all she needed to do was feed him, turn him, and keep him clean, and that would be enough. On the 4th day, Meredith Vale sat down in this chair and told him she didn't believe those 3 lines. She took his left hand, the hand that could still move, and placed it on the metal bed rail. 1 tap means no, she said. 2 taps mean yes. If you understand what I'm saying, tap twice. He lay motionless for 20 seconds. Then that hand lifted, and it struck the bed rail twice, slowly, firmly, unmistakable for anything else in the world. That night, Meredith stepped into the hallway and cried. Not because she pitied him. She cried because she remembered that inside a body unable to speak, there could still be a whole human being sitting there, waiting for someone to ask a question. From then on, every night she asked him 1 question. Only 1, never more. Not because she wanted to learn something, not because she was trying to pry. Only so that he would have something to do with the 1 hand still left to him before morning came. Are you cold? 1 tap. Would you like me to open the window? 2 taps. Is this music bothering you? 1 tap. Do you prefer winter to summer? 2 taps. Very quickly. Would you ever like me to read the newspaper aloud to you? 1 tap. Then, after a moment, 2 very soft taps, as though he had changed his mind. Do you miss someone? 2 taps, hard, so hard that the metal bed rail gave off a faint note that lingered in the darkness. Meredith asked nothing else that night. She simply stayed for another hour, holding his hand until he fell asleep. That had been the 19th night. Now, 7 months had passed. Meredith Vale placed the cream-colored envelope on her lap. She didn't open it. She looked down at Thaddeus Crow's left hand, at the slightly curled fingers, the age spots across the back of it, the wedding ring he still wore even though his wife had died before Meredith was born. Tonight I want to ask you a question, she said. One I've never asked before. His hand didn't move. Outside the window, waves struck the base of the cliffs. Once, twice, then silence. Did you know my mother? She could hear her own heartbeat inside her ears. Her name was Rosalind Vale. The hand remained still on the metal bed rail. It stayed still for a very long time. Meredith counted silently, 10 seconds, 20, 30. She began to think that perhaps he was too tired tonight. She began to think that perhaps she had asked a question too heavy for 1 hand to carry. 40 seconds, 50, 1 minute. Then the hand lifted. It tapped twice. Meredith pressed her palm over her mouth. And then Thaddeus Crow did something he had never done in all those 7 months. He didn't stop at 2, he continued tapping. 3, 4, 5, she lowered her hand. She looked at him. 6, 7, 8, 9. The rhythm was steady and slow, each tap separated by the same precise interval like the grandfather clock in the great hall below. 12, 13, 14. She didn't understand. She began counting aloud very softly, because she was afraid that if she didn't say the numbers aloud, she would lose one of them and never find it again. 18, 19, 20. The hand had begun to slow, but it didn't stop. 25, 26. Sir, she said. 29, 30. Please stop. 35, 36. Then the hand came to rest. Meredith Vale sat in the wooden chair with the cream-colored envelope on her lap, and she didn't need anyone to explain that number to her. He had begun working in this house when he was 36 years old. 36 years ago. She lifted her eyes to his face. The left side of Thaddeus Crow's face remained as calm as it was every other night. But on the right side, the side that had been without feeling for 8 months, the side he could no longer control, tears were running down. They slipped from the corner of his eye, traced the curve of his cheek, gathered at the edge of his jaw, then fell onto the collar of his nightshirt. He didn't wipe them away. He didn't blink. He didn't know he was crying. Meredith Vale came down to the ground floor at nearly 1:00 in the morning, and August Holloway was still sitting in the study, the 3 letters spread before him like 3 pieces of a map that led nowhere. She told him about the 36 taps. He didn't ask her to repeat herself. He simply stood, walked to the fireplace, and remained there with his back turned, his bare hands hanging at his sides. And at that exact moment, a sound drifted in from the corridor, a sound that didn't belong in this house at this hour. The tapping of a cane against the wooden floor. Tap, tap, tap. Slow and steady. The sound of someone who knew exactly where she was going and had no need to hurry. It stopped just beyond the door. Then a woman's voice spoke, roughened by age, but clear in every word, passing through the thick wood as though the wood weren't there at all. "Mr. Holloway. I'm the woman with the cane. I sat at your luncheon table yesterday. Please open the door. I've been waiting for this longer than you imagine." August looked at Meredith. Meredith looked at the door. He walked toward it, placed his hand on the knob, and remained still for 1 beat before turning it. The woman entered slowly. She was short, her back already bent with age, her white hair gathered into a low knot at the nape of her neck. She leaned on a dark wooden cane with a silver cap worn smooth by all the years those fingers had gripped it. The skin of her face was wrinkled like a sheet of paper folded and unfolded too many times. But her eyes weren't old. They were bright and alert, and they swept once across the room, over the 3 letters on the desk, over the Polaroid photograph lying face down, then came to rest on Meredith Vale. She looked at her for a very long time. 2 tears traveled down the wrinkles in her cheeks, and she didn't raise a hand to wipe them away. "You look so much like your mother," she said. "So much that when you crossed the courtyard yesterday, I had to hold on to the arm of my chair." Meredith rose from the leather chair. "Who are you?" "My name is Orla Bennington. I'm 79 years old. For 42 years, I was the head nurse in the emergency department at St. Mercy Hospital. And before that, when I was in my prime, I worked as a traveling midwife in the north, in towns that had no hospitals." The cane struck the floor twice more as she moved closer. "I was in Coldbrook the night your mother gave birth." August Holloway pulled out a chair. Mrs. Orla Bennington sat down, placed both hands on the silver head of her cane, and released a long breath, like someone finally setting down a sack she had carried for a very long time. "7 months ago, I heard that a young woman named Vale had come to work in this house," she said. "From that moment, I began looking for a way inside. The woman wearing the pearl necklace yesterday was a friend of your father's when they were young, Mr. Holloway. She owed me a favor from 983. I collected it. Tell us," August said. She told them. She told them that in those days, Coldbrook had only 1 paved road and 1 wooden bridge across the river. She told them that rain fell for 9 straight days that November, and by the 10th night the bridge was gone. The water carried it away at 4:00 in the morning, and no one heard a thing because the rain drowned out every sound. She told them that in the wooden house at the end of that road, a 4-month-old baby developed a fever, and the fever didn't break for 3 days. The nearest doctor was 40 miles away, on the other side of a river that no longer had a bridge. They sent a man to walk upstream and find another crossing. He walked for 11 hours. "We stayed inside that house," Mrs. Orla said. 4 women, we broke ice from the fish chest on the porch, wrapped it in cloth, and took turns. We had nothing else, no medicine, no machines. We prayed with ice, and with our 2 empty hands, she tightened her grip on the head of the cane. Your mother knelt on that floor for 3 nights. She didn't lie down once. By the 3rd night, she could no longer speak. Her lips only moved. Meredith Vale sat down. She had to sit down. Then, Mrs. Orla said, and her voice changed. A truck stopped at the end of the road just before dawn. A husband and wife who sold cloth were traveling down from Montreal. The collapsed bridge had stranded them, so they had spent the night at the town inn. The wife heard the praying. She came to the house. She stood in the doorway and asked one question. "What did she ask?" August said. She asked, "May I come in? I'm a nurse." In the study, the fire in the hearth collapsed to one side and sent up several small sparks. She had worked for 11 years in a city hospital. In her handbag was a new kind of medicine, something that had only just begun reaching places like Coldbrook that year. She said, "Let me try. If God allows it, the baby will live." Meredith didn't breathe. And the baby lived, Orla Bennington said. She smiled. It was a tired smile, but there was something within it like the sun rising between the wrinkles of her face. The fever broke the next morning. The little boy opened his eyes. He was able to nurse. He lived. Meredith Vale raised both hands to cover her face. But, Mrs. Orla said, and the cane struck the floor once, the story didn't end there. She looked directly at August Halloway. That woman stayed another 10 days. She helped your mother care for the baby. And during those 10 days, she told us that she and her husband couldn't have children. They had been trying for 15 years. Your mother was exhausted. Her heart had been weak since she was a girl. I knew because I had listened to it with my own stethoscope. She had no money. She had no husband. And there was a man in the city who had written to her and told her not to let anyone know. Mrs. Orla paused for a very long time. She gave the little boy to them. My mother gave her child away, Meredith said, and her voice broke on the final word. No child. Mrs. Orla shook her head. She didn't give him away. She saved him. She gave him the only life he could have, in a place where no one would find him. She exhaled. And she paid for that choice until her final breath. August Halloway stood leaning against the edge of the desk, both hands braced against the wood. Do you know where they took him? I do, Mrs. Orla said. I wrote it in a small notebook, and I've kept it for 36 years. She removed the notebook from her coat pocket. Its cover was worn, held closed by a rubber band. Your mother named him Corin. She opened the notebook, but the couple took him back to Providence and gave him another name, so he could begin again. She looked up. Elias Marchetti. August Halloway straightened away from the desk. All the blood drained from his face. August Halloway walked to the second drawer of the walnut desk and opened it with his bare hand. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, the one he had carried to every meeting during his 11 years running Halloway Maritime. He opened it near the middle. A business card was fastened to one page with a tarnished paperclip. The paper was thick and ivory-colored, the embossed letters rising beneath his fingertips. Elias Marchetti, Legal Counsel, Halloway Maritime Group. Beneath that was a telephone number and an address in the center of the city, on the 30th floor. He carried the business card across the desk and handed it to Mrs. Orla Bennington. She pushed her glasses higher on the bridge of her nose, held the card closer to the lamp, and studied it for a long time without blinking. Then she placed it on the desk beside the Polaroid photograph that still lay face down, and she spoke in the voice of someone who had reached the end of a 40-year journey, only to discover that it formed a circle. You've never met this man? Never, August said. He has been your attorney for 11 years. I don't meet with my attorneys. I don't meet with anyone unless it is necessary. Every contract, every document, every signature passes through one man. He paused. Only one man. Meredith Vale raised her head. Who? August Halloway didn't answer her. He looked toward the ceiling, toward the 3rd floor, where an egg-shaped lamp was still glowing in a room whose windows looked out over the bay. He came to work here when he was 36, he said. My father hired him, and my father gave him one order that I never understood until tonight. My son must never meet that attorney. Never, unless the law requires it. Mrs. Orla Bennington placed both hands on the silver head of her cane. Your father made him stand between 2 sons for 36 years, she said, so they would never come face to face. On the 3rd floor, Thaddeus Crow heard footsteps running up the wooden staircase. He couldn't move. He couldn't turn his head, but he could hear, and he knew at once whose footsteps they were, and he understood that the day he had prayed for every night for 32 years had finally come. It had come when he could no longer speak. His left hand lifted from the blanket. It trembled. It searched for the metal bed rail, but the bedroom door didn't open. The footsteps passed by, and he lay there in the darkness with one hand raised in the air, a man who possessed every answer and had no way to release them. At 3 o'clock in the morning, August Halloway was alone in the study. Mrs. Orla had been taken to the east sitting room to rest. Meredith had gone upstairs to Thaddeus. The 3 letters lay folded on the desk. He walked to the filing cabinet in the corner, opened the bottom drawer, and removed a stack of papers held inside a blue folder. A typed label had been affixed to the cover. Home Medical Care Personnel, Approved Candidates. He had read this file 7 months earlier, on an afternoon in November, before signing the employment contract. He opened it. The first page held an identification photograph. A 28-year-old woman with her hair tied low, not smiling. The second page was a background statement. He began reading again from the beginning, line by line, and he counted. The first line, full name. The second line, date of birth. The third line, social security number. The ninth line, professional qualification, Bachelor of Science in Nursing. The 10th line, most recent place of employment, St. Mercy Hospital, Emergency Department. The 11th line, reason employment ended. The 12th line, status of professional license permanently revoked. The 13th line, marital status. The 14th line, place of birth, Coldbrook, New Hampshire. August Holloway sat motionless. He had read that line before. 7 months earlier, beneath this lamp, in this chair, his eyes had passed over those words, and he had turned the page. And someone might have believed that he hadn't seen her during those 7 months. Someone might have believed that the woman was nothing more than a shadow folding towels on the 3rd floor, that he had passed her hundreds of times without ever knowing her face. But the truth was that he had known very well. He knew her nursing license had been permanently revoked. He knew she had signed an admission of wrongdoing without filing an appeal. He knew there wasn't a hospital left in the state that would hire her. He knew she was living in a rented room with no heat. He had read all of it, and he had signed the contract. And when the personnel manager asked why he had chosen a nurse who had lost her license to care for the person he valued most in this house, he had answered with a single sentence: "I need someone who knows how to keep her mouth shut, and no one in this world keeps silent better than someone who has lost everything by opening it." He hadn't hired her because he pitied her. He had hired her because she had been crucified, and a crucified person wouldn't tell anyone what she saw inside this house. August Holloway closed the file. He placed both bare hands on the walnut desk and looked at them. Then he stood, left the study, walked along the corridor, opened the door leading to the basement, and descended into the darkness. There was no one below, only unfinished concrete walls and several empty wine racks. He didn't shout. He had never shouted in his life. He simply raised his fist and struck the wall, then again, until the skin across his knuckles split open and blood left dark streaks on the gray concrete. He stood there for a long time, with his forehead resting against the wall, breathing. The following morning, when he stepped out of his room, both hands were covered in black leather gloves. The people of the northeastern harbor still believed August Holloway wore gloves to conceal old scars, things he didn't want to remember. That morning, those gloves weren't hiding any scar. They were hiding the cowardice of the night before. Nettie Pryor was 22 years old and had worked as an assistant cook at Holloway House for 5 months. At 3:00 in the morning, she went down to the kitchen for water because she couldn't sleep, and as she passed the western staircase, she saw a woman standing on the landing, speaking very softly on the telephone. Nettie stopped. She heard Celeste Ashford say that the day after tomorrow was the final day, that the nurse girl had been in the study for nearly 4 hours, and that everything had to be moved forward. Then Celeste said something that made Nettie Pryor grip the banister. She wasn't speaking to Boyd. She said, "Yes, Uncle, I understand." The next morning, Nettie knocked on the study door and repeated every word she had heard, both hands still dusted with flour. August Holloway listened to the entire account. He didn't ask a single question. After the young woman left, he remained seated for a very long time, and Mrs. Orla Bennington, who was sitting in the corner with her cane propped beside her knee, was the first to speak. "You already know who he is, don't you?" "In this entire northeastern harbor," August said, "there is only one man who allows other people to call him uncle." He rose and walked toward the arched window. "He has never had an office. He has never put his name on a company. He has never been photographed. In 30 years, no one has seen him step aboard a ship. But you know his name. My father spoke that name only once in his life." August turned around. "The night before he died, he gripped my wrist and told me, 'Never sit at the same table as Gideon Rook.'" Mrs. Orla closed her eyes. "He is still alive," she said. "I have feared that for 36 years." Meredith Vale stood with her back against the bookcase, both hands resting on her stomach. "Who is he, Mom?" Orla Bennington opened her eyes. She looked at Meredith, then at August, then down at her aged hands, tightening around the silver head of the cane. "Gideon Rook is 62 years old. He began working on the docks when he was 13. He couldn't read until he was 20, but he understood people, and he understood that in a harbor, the man who knew who owed what to whom held the entire harbor in the palm of his hand." She breathed out. "And the man he trained, the man he pulled up from the hold of a ship, The man he sat beside every night and taught to write a signature that looked like the hand of an educated gentleman was named Cassius Halloway. August Halloway stood frozen beside the window. "Your father learned everything from him," Mrs. Orla said. "How to say little. How to wait. How to make other men kneel without touching them. Your father was the finest student Gideon Rook ever had. So fine that when your father was 32, he drove his own teacher out of the harbor, and he did it so cleanly that Gideon Rook didn't even understand what he was losing until it was gone." 30 years ago, August said. 30 years ago, she nodded. "The same year your mother left Coldbrook, child." Meredith pulled away from the bookcase. "What did you say?" Mrs. Orla Bennington sat straighter. Her eyes, the eyes that refused to grow old, looked directly at the young woman standing before her. "I was inside that wooden house on the night your mother gave birth, but 3 months before that night, a strange man came to Coldbrook. In the study, the fire in the hearth had gone out long ago, leaving only warm ashes. He didn't threaten her. He didn't raise his voice. He walked into the shop where she sold cloth, bought 2 yards of cotton, paid for it, and while she wrapped his purchase, he told her that he knew whose child she was carrying." Meredith raised one hand and gripped the edge of the bookcase. "That was all," Mrs. Orla said. "He said nothing more. He took the wrapped cloth and left. That night, your mother came to my house. She sat on the front step and didn't cry. She asked me only one question. She asked, how can a child grow up without anyone knowing who his father is?" August Halloway had to reach out and grip the window frame. "And your father," Mrs. Orla turned toward him, her voice softening, "received a message like that during the same month. No one knows what Gideon Rook said to him, but from that moment, your father stopped writing letters. From that moment, he married another man's daughter. From that moment, he sent money north every month through an intermediary. And he never, not once during the remaining 40 years of his life, set foot in Coldbrook again." She lowered her eyes. "All my life, I believed your father was a greedy man. I believed he had abandoned a woman and a child to protect his name. He wasn't greedy," she said. "He was afraid. He was so afraid that he didn't dare save his own son." No one spoke for a very long time. Then August Halloway moved away from the window. He walked to the desk, picked up the embossed business card, and looked at the name printed upon it. "Nettie heard her call him uncle," he said. "That means he has already been sitting inside this house. He may have been sitting here for 9 years. What are you going to do?" August placed the business card on the desk. "What I cannot do," he said, "is touch him." He looked at Meredith, then at Mrs. Orla. "There are nearly 300 men in this harbor. Half of them borrowed money from him when they were desperate. Half of them call him uncle. If I move against Gideon Rook, I lose the harbor within 48 hours. Outside, the sun began to rise over the bay. And somewhere in a room in the city, a 62-year-old man sat beside a cup of cold tea, heard his telephone vibrate, and smiled. 36 years ago, he said to the person on the other end of the line, I took Cassius Halloway's firstborn son from him. He set down the cup of tea. Today, I'll take the other 2. At 3 o'clock the following morning, August Halloway's car stopped in front of a glass building in the center of the city. He was driving. Meredith Vale sat in the passenger seat. Mrs. Orla Bennington sat in the back, with her cane resting across her lap. No one spoke a single word during the 20-minute journey. The elevator carried them to the 30th floor, and when the doors opened, the gray-carpeted corridor was so quiet that the silver tip of Mrs. Orla's cane could be heard touching the floor. Tap, tap. Tap. August stopped before the door marked 3002. He raised his hand, then lowered it, then he knocked. The door opened after 4 beats. Elias Marchetti was 36 years old, wearing a white shirt that still held the crisp lines of the iron, his tie removed and draped over one shoulder. In his hand was a glass of water. He looked at the man standing outside his home and couldn't speak, because in 11 years as legal counsel for Halloway Maritime Group, he had never seen this face in person. He had seen it only on the pages of financial newspapers, and among all the possibilities he had ever imagined, not one of them began at 3 o'clock in the morning. The blood drained from his face. Mr. Halloway, let us in. Has something happened? Yes. August stepped aside. There is someone who wants to meet you. She has been waiting for 36 years. Mrs. Orla Bennington came forward, leaning on her cane, and lifted her eyes toward the tall man standing in the doorway. She looked at him for a very long time. She studied his forehead, the bridge of his nose, the line of his hair at his left temple. Then she spoke, and her voice grew rough. You look so much like your father. The glass in Elias Marchetti's hand tilted. Water spilled onto the carpet. He didn't notice. They sat in the living room. No one turned on the main lights. The glow of the city 30 floors below rose through the windows, giving them just enough light to see one another's faces. Mrs. Orla told the story. She told it from the beginning, leaving nothing out and adding nothing. She told them about Coldbrook, about the wooden bridge, about the 3 nights and the pieces of cloth wrapped around ice. She told them about the woman who sold fabric standing in the doorway and the questions she had asked. She told them about the 10 days that followed. She told them about a 24-year-old mother, with a weak heart, no money, and no husband, kneeling on a wooden floor and placing her son into the arms of 2 strangers in order to save him. She told them about an old name no one remembered anymore, Corin. Elias Marchetti sat motionless from beginning to end. He didn't interrupt once. His hands rested on his knees, and when Mrs. Orla finished, they remained exactly where they were. He stood. He walked out onto the balcony. The glass door slid open. The night wind from the bay rushed into the room. Then the door closed again. Inside, the 3 of them watched his back as he stood beside the railing. He didn't move. He didn't raise a hand to his face. He simply stood there looking down at the city, where rows of streetlights stretched toward the harbor. He remained there for 5 minutes. Meredith Vale looked at the clock on the wall 3 times. Mrs. Orla Bennington never took her eyes from the glass. Then the sliding door opened. Elias Marchetti stepped inside. His eyes were red but dry. The first thing he said wasn't about Cassius Halloway. It wasn't about Rosaline Vale. It wasn't about 36 years. He looked directly at August. "If I walk into that boardroom tomorrow as your brother," he said, "what surname will my daughter grow up carrying?" No one could answer that question. She is 4 years old. Her name is Wren. She carries the name of the man who raised me. A man who never slept peacefully for a single night of his life, because he was afraid I wouldn't have enough to eat. His voice was perfectly calm, and it was that calmness that made the room feel heavier. He died when I was 29. The woman who carried me out of Coldbrook is still alive in Providence, and she calls me every Sunday. He sat on the edge of the chair. All my life, I have known that a piece of me was missing. I didn't know what to call it. I love my parents. I never went looking. He lowered his head. Now you bring it to my door at 3 o'clock in the morning, and you expect me to open it. August Halloway stood. He said nothing. He simply remained there with his gloved hands hanging at his sides. Elias Marchetti looked up. He looked at August. Then he looked at Meredith Vale, the woman sitting with both hands resting over her 7-month pregnant belly. He rose. "Brother," he said. "Sister." The 3 of them stood in the middle of the room, and for the first 3 seconds no one stepped closer. Then August took 1 step forward. Then Meredith did the same. And they stood there holding one another, 3 grown people, none of them crying aloud, beneath the glow of the city rising from 30 floors below. Mrs. Orla Bennington sat in her chair, with both hands folded over the silver head of her cane, and she smiled the most peaceful smile of her entire life. Half an hour later, Elias Marchetti switched on the lamp over his desk. Beneath the paperweight lay a file he had received the previous afternoon, the last will and testament of Cassius Halloway. He was supposed to authenticate it before the board of directors at noon the following day. He opened the filing cabinet and removed 3 original documents that Cassius himself had signed during his lifetime. He placed them side by side beneath the lamp, the 8-pointed compass, the letter H in the center. He bent over them for a long time, holding a magnifying glass in one hand. "Brother," he said without looking up. "Which hand did our father favor?" "His left," August answered. He wrote with his left hand. Elias Marchetti nodded slowly. On these 3 original documents, every compass was drawn beginning from the left side. The needle pointing north leans slightly to the left. That is the habit of a left-handed person. A left-handed writer pulls the line toward himself. He pushed the new will into the center of the desk. "But on this one," he said, "the north needle leans to the right," he straightened, "and the clause transferring the shares was drafted using a legal formatting template that my firm only began using in the spring of last year." He looked at August Halloway. "This document isn't old, brother. It is 3 weeks old. At 4:20 in the morning, they left the glass building." Elias Marchetti remained behind with the forged will and the 3 original documents, because by noon he would need enough evidence to say aloud, before 11 men, what he had just discovered. Mrs. Orla Bennington dozed in the back seat. her cane resting against her shoulder. Meredith Vale sat beside August with both hands over her stomach, her eyes open and fixed beyond the window. Rain had begun at some point without any of them noticing. The first rain of summer, not heavy, only enough to make the road shine beneath the streetlights. August Holloway took the Harbor Road because it was 14 minutes shorter. It was the only decision he made that night which he would never regret, because had he taken the longer route, they would simply have been stopped somewhere else, somewhere darker, with no one there to witness it. Pier number 3 stood between two rows of warehouses. Only one sodium lamp was still burning, hanging crookedly from a leaning pole, and casting a pool of orange light across the concrete. Inside that pool of light stood 6 shadows. They were spread across the road in a line, making no effort to conceal themselves, waiting. August Holloway lifted his foot from the accelerator. The car rolled forward, slowing, then stopped about 15 paces away. Mrs. Orla woke. Mr. Holloway. Stay seated. He turned off the engine but left the headlights on. Then he turned toward Meredith. Lock the doors. All 4 of them. Don't open them. No matter what happens, Mr. Holloway. Don't open them. He opened the car door and stepped into the rain. He walked around the front of the car, and there, beneath the headlights, he did something both Meredith and Mrs. Orla could see clearly through the windshield. He raised one hand and removed the glove from his left hand. He pulled it free one finger at a time. Then he removed the right glove. He smoothed them both, folded them, and placed them carefully on the hood, neatly side by side. He did it with the gestures of a man preparing to roll up his sleeves and repair the kitchen faucet in his own home. Then he walked toward the 6 shadows. 40 seconds. Meredith Vale sat inside the car, and she couldn't see anything clearly because rain streamed down the glass, and because the headlights reached only so far. She could only listen. She heard steel strike concrete, short and dry. She heard someone exhale sharply, very close. She heard someone lose his footing on the rain-slick surface and fall, and the splash of water rising around him. She heard something made of metal rolling away, rolling farther and farther, then dropping over the edge of the pier and disappearing. And through all those sounds, she heard August Holloway's shoes on the wet concrete, steady, never quickening by even a single beat. From beginning to end, he didn't run, he walked. Then silence. One man remained standing. He was almost as tall as August, with lighter hair, his right hand hidden behind his back. His coat was expensive, and now it was soaked through. Boyd, August said. Boyd Holloway didn't answer. You are my uncle's son. August's voice was ordinary, as though the 2 men were standing in the corridor outside a wedding. I was 10 when you were born. They let me into the hospital room, and they placed you in my arms. I remember you were so light that I thought I was holding a towel. Something flickered across Boyd Holloway's face, then vanished. He brought his right hand out from behind his back. August saw it. He saw it very clearly beneath the sodium light, from no more than an arm's length away. He didn't step back, he stood still, and Boyd Holloway lunged. One thrust, the left side of his ribs. Meredith Vale sprang from her seat, her hand striking the glass. August Holloway didn't fall. He didn't even stagger. He remained standing for another heartbeat, his eyes still fixed on the eyes of the man before him. Then his left hand rose, slowly, almost gently, and closed around Boyd's wrist. He turned it, not hard, only through a very small angle, the way someone turns a doorknob. The knife fell onto the concrete. August bent down and picked it up. He held it in his bare hand. He held it for 3 seconds. Across his white shirt, over his left ribs, a dark stain was slowly spreading. Boyd Holloway stood rooted to the spot. He knew very well what was permitted to happen next. Everyone in the northeastern harbor knew the 3rd rule. No one touches my people. He had just touched the man himself. He waited. August Holloway turned, walked 3 steps to the edge of the pier, and threw the knife into the sea. It fell without making any sound worth hearing. He turned back. Go home, Boyd. The other man opened his mouth, then closed it. Tell Gideon Rook that I spared you. August stepped closer by 1 pace, and this time his voice dropped so low that only the 2 of them could hear. And tell him I spared you because I want him to know that I can, not because I cannot. Boyd Holloway stepped back. Then he turned away and walked into the darkness between the 2 rows of warehouses, and he didn't look back once. August Holloway stood alone inside the pool of orange light. He raised one hand and pressed it against his left side. He held it there. Then he walked back toward the car, slowly, and at some point Meredith Vale had unlocked the door without anyone telling her to. He leaned against the hood for one beat to catch his breath. Rainwater ran down his face. And there, directly beneath his hand, on the slick, wet metal, the black leather gloves still lay exactly where he had placed them, folded neatly, side by side. Not a single drop of blood. They returned to the 30th floor because it was the closest place, and because no one in the car wanted to speak the name of a hospital aloud. Elias Marchetti opened his door for the second time that night, and this time he asked no questions. He simply swept the stack of papers off the kitchen table with one arm. August Holloway sat on the edge of it. He removed his own coat. He asked no one for help. The white shirt over his left side had darkened into a wide stain, and the stain was still spreading. Mrs. Orla Bennington stood in the kitchen doorway, with both hands resting on her cane, and she didn't step inside because she was 79 years old, and her hands had been trembling for 10 years. Meredith Vale opened the cabinet beneath the sink, found a first aid kit, and stood holding it exactly 2 paces from the table. She didn't move any closer. "I'm not permitted to touch you." August looked up at her. "My license was permanently revoked. If I stitch you, I'll be violating the medical practice laws of this state. If anyone finds out, I won't only lose my job, I'll lose the baby. They'll say I'm unfit." She held the first aid kit tightly against her chest. "Do you understand?" "I can't." August Holloway didn't beg. He took the telephone from his trouser pocket, pressed the screen twice, and raised it to his ear. "Ferris, 30th floor, number 3002. 30 minutes. He placed the telephone on the table. "Do you think I don't have doctors?" he said. "I have 4, 1 in Boston, 1 here, 2 in New York. I pay them more than the hospitals do. Then why are you sitting there looking at me?" "Because I want to know what you'll do." No one in the kitchen breathed. "I've employed you for 7 months, he said. "For 7 months I haven't known who you are. You care for him as though he were your own father. But you've never once looked me directly in the eyes. Not once." The dark stain had reached his waist. His face was as white as paper. "I'm about to lose consciousness," he said. "Ferris will come. I'll live. The only question in this room is whether you'll remain standing there or step forward." Then he fell. Elias caught him by the shoulders. Meredith Vale remained where she was for 1 more beat. Then she stepped forward. She placed the first aid kit on the table. She washed her hands beneath water so hot that her skin turned red. She told Elias to hold the light. She told Mrs. Orla to boil water. Her voice had changed into the voice of someone who had once stood in an emergency room at 3 o'clock in the morning. And no one in that apartment dared argue with her by so much as half a word. And with the first stitch, she threw away everything she still had left in the world. By the time she finished, dawn had begun to brighten the sky. August Holloway lay on the sofa, breathing evenly. He would live. Dr. Ferris arrived 20 minutes late, examined the stitches, and said nothing. He only looked at Meredith for a very long time, then quietly gave August an antibiotic injection. Meredith rose from the small stool. She stood too quickly. For a moment the kitchen tilted, and she had to grip the edge of the table. Then she looked down. On the inside of her thigh, beneath the fabric, there was a streak. Not much, only a streak. Meredith Vale stood motionless for 3 seconds. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet door and placed both hands over her stomach. She didn't call anyone. Mrs. Orla was in the other room. Elias was speaking with the law firm. Dr. Ferris had just entered the elevator. There were 4 conscious people within 15 yards, and Meredith Vale sat alone on the white-tiled kitchen floor, both hands cradling 7 months, making no sound at all. August found her 10 minutes later. He shouldn't have stood. He stood. He walked to the kitchen doorway with one hand pressed against his side, saw her sitting there, and lowered himself to his knees. "We're going to the hospital." She shook her head. "I'll pay." "We're leaving now. You don't understand." Then her voice broke. For the first time in this entire story, that woman's voice broke. "If I walk through the emergency room doors, they'll create a record. If there is a record, the system will discover who I am. A woman whose nursing license was revoked. No official employment. No husband. Living in the house of a man half this state is afraid of." She lifted her face toward him. "They'll take my baby the moment it is born. And I'll have nothing to fight them with." August Holloway knelt on the kitchen floor, blood still seeping through the bandage over his side, and for 5 seconds he said nothing. Then he stood. He went into the corridor. He made 1 telephone call. 40 minutes later, a 70-year-old man entered the apartment on the 30th floor. He wore a sweater and carried no medical bag, only a gray plastic case with a handle. He asked no one's name. He didn't ask why there was blood on the floor. He didn't take out a single sheet of paper. He set down the case, opened it, and removed an old portable ultrasound machine. "Please lie down for me." Meredith lay on the sofa. Elias turned off the ceiling light. Mrs. Orla Bennington stood at the foot of the sofa, with both hands folded over the silver head of her cane. The old doctor spread gel over Meredith's stomach. He placed the probe against her skin. The small screen lit up with a grainy gray image. He moved the probe very slowly. No one in the room breathed. Then he turned the volume knob, and the entire apartment on the 30th floor heard it. Fast, very fast, steady. A tiny heartbeat beating inside a body no longer than an adult hand, coming through the crackling speaker of an old machine, filling the room, filling the corridor, filling every inch of space between those walls. 3 years, $214 every month. 36 transfers. The winters without heat. The months when she ate instant noodles for 3 weeks straight. The cold room outside Providence she had never entered. The letter lying between a pizza advertisement and the electric bill. 90 days. $4,600 from the condolence money given at her mother's funeral. And it was still beating. Meredith Vale began to weep. Not the kind of crying people showed in films. There wasn't a single tear slipping gracefully down one cheek. She covered her face with both hands and cried like an animal, the sound broken and uncontrollable. The kind of cry a human being makes only 2 or 3 times in an entire lifetime. Mrs. Orla Bennington bent down, placed her aged hand on Meredith's hair, and said nothing. The old doctor kept the probe exactly where it was, holding it still so the heartbeat could continue filling the room. And August Halloway stood in the corner. He remained there for a while. Then he turned his face toward the wall. In 34 years, no one had ever seen him cry. That morning, not a single person in the room turned around to look at him. That afternoon, August Halloway wasn't at home. Dr. Ferris had forbidden him to stand for more than 10 minutes at a time, and he had spent the entire morning sitting in the car in the basement of the glass building, with Elias Marchetti and the 3 original documents, preparing for the 11 men who would take their seats at the conference table at noon the following day. Meredith Vale was brought back to Halloway House at 2 o'clock. She went up to the 3rd floor, changed the bed sheets, recorded the blood pressure reading, and was about to go down to the kitchen for Thaddeus Crow's light meal when she heard the front door open in the great hall below. It wasn't the bell. No one had rung. The door had been opened from inside. Celeste Ashford opened it for him. Meredith stood on the 2nd floor landing and looked down. The man who entered wasn't tall. He was thin, his silver hair cut short, and he wore a coarse cloth coat like a retired man taking a walk along the shore. He removed his hat and held it in one hand. No one accompanied him. There was no car waiting beyond the gates. He crossed the marble floor of Halloway House slowly, looking around not with the eyes of a guest, but with the eyes of a man returning to a room where he had once slept. The 3rd floor, isn't it, child? Yes, Uncle. Meredith Vale had no time to think. She turned and hurried back upstairs, entered Thaddeus's room, pressed herself behind the partly open door, slipped one hand into her apron pocket, and pressed the record button on her telephone. She activated it in the second after the footsteps stopped outside the room. Gideon Rook entered. He didn't knock. "Hello, Thaddeus," he said. He pulled over the wooden chair where Meredith sat every evening, placed it beside the bed, and sat down with his hat resting on his knees. He sat like an old friend visiting on a quiet afternoon. "You don't look as bad as I expected." On the bed, Thaddeus Crow opened his eyes. "Do you remember that rainy night in 1978? The night you and I dragged 2 tons of rotten fish into the sea because Cassia said it had to be finished before dawn. You vomited 3 times. I didn't." He laughed softly. "You were only 26 then." From inside his coat, he removed a typed sheet of paper folded in half. He opened it and placed it on the lap of the man lying in the bed. Then he set a pen beside it. "Shall I read it to you?" He read in a calm voice without emphasis. It was a sworn statement. It said that in March of that year, the undersigned had heard August Halloway order 2 men to end his father's life. It said that the undersigned had remained silent for all those years out of fear. It had a date. It had a blank space for a signature. "You don't need to write," Gideon Rook said. "You cannot hold a pen, I know. I understand the arrangement between you and that nurse. 1 tap means no. 2 taps mean yes." Behind the partly open door, Meredith Vale didn't dare breathe. "I only need 2 taps." There will be witnesses who can testify that I read this statement aloud to you and that you agreed. It is called expressed intent. The law allows it. I have attorneys." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat a second time. He took out a photograph. He placed it on the small bedside table beneath the egg-shaped lamp, turning it so it faced the correct way. In the picture, a middle-aged woman stood in front of a wooden porch, somewhere with snow along the edge of the yard. Her hair was tied at the nape of her neck. She was holding a grandchild in her arms, and she was smiling, a wide, innocent smile belonging to someone who didn't know she was being photographed. "She is still in Ohio," Gideon Rook said. "Chestnut Street, the 4th house from the intersection. She teaches music at an elementary school. She believes you died 20 years ago, because someone wrote her a letter saying so." Thaddeus Crow's left hand remained motionless on the blanket. "I don't want anything from her," he said. "I only want you to know that I know where she is." He leaned back in the chair. "Tap twice, Thaddeus, then she can continue living peacefully for the rest of her life. And you have been lying here for 8 months. What do you have left to lose?" The egg-shaped lamp cast a circle of yellow light across the blanket. 30 seconds passed. No one moved. There was no sound except the waves striking the base of the cliffs below. Then Thaddeus Crow's left hand lifted. It trembled. It searched for the metal bedrail. It found it. It tapped once. No. Gideon Rook sat still. The hand lifted again. One tap, then another, then another. It didn't stop. It tapped a 4th time, a 5th, a 6th. Each tap came at the same measured interval, slow and steady, like a man driving one nail after another into a door. The 10th, the 11th. Behind the partly open door, Meredith Vale clung to the wooden frame with one hand covering her mouth, while the other still held the telephone inside her apron pocket. The 18th, the 19th. Gideon Rook said nothing. He sat with both hands resting on the brim of his hat, and he watched. The 25th. The rhythm had begun to slow. The hand lifted with greater difficulty, and each time it fell, it struck more heavily. The 30th. His knuckles had changed color. He didn't stop. The 35th, the 36th, the 37th. Only one sound remained in the entire room, metal and bone, repeating again and again with nothing else in the world. The 39th, the 40th. Then the hand fell onto the blanket, and it didn't rise again. Gideon Rook remained seated for a while. Then he stood. He picked up the paper from Thaddeus's lap, folded it in half, folded it once more, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat. He lifted the photograph from the bedside table, looked at it for 1 second, then placed it back exactly where it had been, facing the same direction, and left it there. He put on his hat. At the doorway, he stopped and turned his head. "For 36 years you opened doors for other people, Thaddeus. You held doors for Cassius. You held doors for his son. You held doors for guests, for attorneys, for 2 children who were never allowed to meet." He looked down at the hand lying motionless on the blanket. "Not once in your entire life did you walk through a door yourself." Then he spoke his final sentence so softly that Meredith Vale had to listen to the recording 3 times that night before she could make out the words. "This is the first time in my life I have ever seen a real man," and he walked out. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Meredith Vale woke in the armchair, placed in the corner of the 3rd floor room. She didn't know when she had fallen asleep there, still wearing her apron, the telephone containing the recording inside her pocket. She didn't wake because of a sound. She woke because something was missing from the room. The sound of breathing was gone. She switched on the table lamp, and she saw it immediately. Thaddeus Crow's left hand had slipped from the blanket and was hanging beside the bed. The left corner of his mouth had fallen. His pupils were unequal. His breathing came in broken intervals, with a long pause between each breath. She had seen these signs during 8 years of working in the emergency room, and she had spoken the same words hundreds of times into a radio. The brief 4-word sentence that sent an entire floor running. She knew exactly what was happening inside this man's head. She knew that if he reached the emergency room at St. Mercy within 90 minutes, there might still be something they could do. She also knew how long an ambulance would take to travel from the nearest station to the cliffs. 19 minutes, she reached for the telephone, and the left hand lifted. It struck the metal bed rail. 1 tap, 2 taps, 3 taps. 3 taps didn't exist in their language. For 210 nights, there had only been 1 and 2, never 3. Meredith Vale stood frozen with the telephone in her hand. Then she understood. She placed the telephone on the table. She pulled the wooden chair close to the side of the bed and sat down. She held that hand between both of hers. "Listen to me," she said, and her voice was very calm, the voice she always used when she had to tell someone something no one wanted to hear. "You've had a second stroke. It is worse than the first." The hand remained still. "If I call now, they'll take you away at 2:20. You'll enter the imaging room at 3. They may be able to keep you alive, they may not. But you'll be lying in there, and you won't regain consciousness in time," she swallowed. "If I don't call, you'll die." The hand lifted. One tap. "Yes, you understand that." One tap. Meredith Vale closed her eyes. "You want to live until noon tomorrow." The hand lifted more slowly than before. It fell against the bed rail. 2 taps. The egg-shaped lamp was still glowing in the room. On the small bedside table, the photograph of the woman in Ohio remained where Gideon Rook had placed it, and she was still smiling. Meredith sat silently for a very long time. She knew that if anyone discovered what she was doing, she would lose everything. She also knew that this was what he wanted. She stood. She walked to the medicine cabinet mounted on the bathroom wall, the small white-painted wooden cabinet with a mirror on the front, and opened it. There was nothing inside that an ordinary family wouldn't have. She took down what she needed. She carried those things back and placed them on the table. Then she sat in the wooden chair and began to count. She counted his breaths. She counted the pulse at his wrist. She measured his blood pressure with the portable monitor and wrote the number in the small notebook on the windowsill, just as she had done every evening for the past 7 months. 3:10, 4 o'clock, 4:45. Twice during that night, Thaddeus Crow's breathing stopped long enough for Meredith Vale to spring from the chair, and both times it began again. 5:30. Beyond the window, the bay changed from black to leaden gray. 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. She didn't eat. She didn't leave that chair for more than 3 minutes at a time. Sometimes she spoke to him about small, ordinary things, about how the vending machine on the 4th floor of St. Mercy still swallowed coins, about how her mother had once sold fabric in a small shop when she was young, about how Meredith had not yet chosen a name for the baby. 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. The nurse whose professional license had been permanently revoked sat beside that bed for 11 hours. She didn't call an ambulance. She didn't call anyone. She kept a man on this side of death with the things found inside a family medicine cabinet, and by counting every breath he took until daylight fully arrived. At 9:40, the left hand moved. Meredith leaned forward. It struck the bed rail. 1 tap, 2 taps, 3 taps. Then Thaddeus Crow did something he had not done during the 8 months he had lain paralyzed. He turned his head. Very slowly, little by little, his neck turned to the left, and his gaze moved downward, then farther down, until it stopped at one fixed point in the room. His wheelchair. It stood in the corner beside the window, covered with a cotton cloth. He looked at it. He looked at it for a very long time. Meredith Vale stood. She walked to the wheelchair. She pulled away the cloth. She looked down at the worn brown leather seat cushion, and she saw it. Along the rear edge of the cushion was a line of hand stitching. It wasn't factory stitching. The thread was thin and ivory white, the stitches even but slightly too large, the kind of stitching made by a man working at night beneath a table lamp, determined to finish the task rather than make it beautiful. Meredith turned to look at him. He was looking at her. She took the medical scissors from the first aid kit. She knelt beside the wheelchair, slipped the tip of the scissors beneath the first thread, and cut. The thread broke apart in brittle, aged sections. She slid her hand beneath the leather. Inside was a notebook. Its cover was brown leather, its corners worn round, tied closed with a thin leather cord wrapped around it 3 times. Embossed into the cover, almost completely faded, was an 8-pointed compass with the letter H in its center. Meredith Vale sank to the floor with the notebook resting on her lap. Thaddeus Crow had kept it for 32 years. For the past 8 months, he had sat on it every day, pushed throughout the house, through the great hall, along the corridors, past the very study door where August Halloway sat reading forged documents, and he had possessed no way to speak. She looked up. On the bed, the man had closed his eyes, but his chest was still rising and falling. There were 2 hours left until noon. At 11:30 in the morning, the conference room on the 30th floor of the Halloway Maritime Building opened. 3 walls were made of glass, and beyond them the entire bay stretched beneath the July sun. Container ships lined up, waiting to enter the harbor like a row of words written across the water. In the center of the room stood a walnut table 9 meters long and 12 leather chairs. 11 men and 1 woman took their places one by one. The 8th chair from the northern end of the table remained empty. It belonged to Rennick Vaughn, owner of the 3 warehouses in the south. No one asked why. No one looked at it for more than a second. Celeste Ashford entered at 11:40. Red dress, hair pinned high, lips painted darker than usual. She walked around the table, lightly touched the shoulders of 2 board members, and smiled at a third. Boyd Halloway entered 3 minutes later. A leather briefcase rested beneath his left arm. His right wrist was wrapped in a white bandage, half concealed inside the sleeve of his suit jacket. Celeste leaned close and kissed him lightly on the cheek. "Is everything done?" "Done. Has the attorney arrived?" "He will." The clock on the wall showed 11:50. The door opened for the first time. A 22-year-old young woman entered, wearing a light coat in place of her apron, both hands tightly clasped before her stomach. Nettie Pryor walked to the far end of the room and stood against the glass wall without sitting. Celeste Ashford turned to look at her. At first, she didn't recognize her. Then she did, and something very small leaped inside her eyes before disappearing. The door opened for the second time. A cane struck the floor 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. Mrs. Orla Bennington entered very slowly. Her silver hair gathered in a low knot, and she didn't look at anyone. She walked to the chair at the end of the table, pulled it out herself, and sat down without assistance. She rested her cane against the side of the chair. Whispering began to move through the room. The door opened for the 3rd time. August Halloway entered, pushing a wheelchair. Thaddeus Crowe sat in it. He was dressed in an old gray suit, his tie neatly fastened, a thin blanket laid across his knees, his head tilted slightly to the right. His eyes were open. The 11 people in the conference room rose to their feet. No one told them to. No one gave a signal. But in the northeastern harbor, there were men who had never stepped aboard a ship and whose names everyone still knew. And when that man was brought into a room, people stood. August pushed the wheelchair into the corner beside the window, where the light was strongest. He locked the wheels. He rested one hand on the man's shoulder for a single beat, then walked to the head of the table and sat down. Meredith Vale entered last and stood beside the wheelchair, and no one on the board knew who she was. Celeste Ashford was still smiling. Then the door opened for the 4th time. It didn't open partway. Both panels swung wide, and the man who entered was 36 years old, wearing a white shirt and a dark blue tie, carrying a file beneath one arm and 3 original documents in his hands. Elias Marchetti. Boyd Halloway dropped his leather briefcase onto the floor. Its clasp sprang open, and papers slid across the polished wood. The smile on Celeste Ashford's face vanished at that exact moment, like a candle smothered beneath a glass. She stood. She looked at Elias. She looked at Mrs. Orla. She looked at the wheelchair in the corner. And she understood very quickly, faster than any of the men seated around that table, that 9 years of her life had just collapsed in the span of 3 breaths. But Celeste Ashford wasn't the kind of person who collapsed with the thing she had built. She opened the handbag on the table and removed 2 sheets of paper. She placed the first on the walnut surface and pushed it into the center of the table. It was a copy of the State Medical Board's decision permanently revoking the nursing license of a woman named Meredith Vale. She placed the second sheet beside it, an anonymous complaint filed with the Department of Social Services, dated 3 weeks earlier, stating that the woman in question was pregnant, had no lawful employment, had no stable residence, and was living in the home of a man suspected of involvement in organized crime. "You want the harbor, then take it," Celeste Ashford said. Her voice had become sweet again. "I won't argue. I've lost." She looked directly at Meredith. "But no one here will get the child inside her. The state will take it, and I won't have to do another thing." Somewhere in the conference room, a man cleared his throat. August Halloway placed both hands on the table. He hadn't yet begun to rise, because Meredith Vale stood before he could. She left her place beside the wheelchair. She walked 3 steps to the edge of the table. She didn't pick up either sheet of paper. She didn't look down at them. "You say I'm unfit to be a mother," she said. The entire room fell silent. "I want to ask everyone in this room one question." She lifted her head and looked around the 9-meter table, one face at a time. 11 faces. The people who controlled the northeastern harbor, Taylor's suits. Watches worth more than she earned in an entire year. How many people in this room know how to place 2 fingers against the throat of a dying man and tell you whether he is still alive? No one answered. No one dared look toward the wheelchair in the corner. "One," Meredith Vale said. She allowed the silence to remain long enough. "And you just called that person a servant." She stepped back 3 paces. She sat in the chair beside Mrs. Orla Bennington. At the northern end of the table, August Holloway said nothing. His 10 fingers tightened around the edge of the walnut table. And in that silence, all 12 people in the room heard the wood crack. The sound of cracking wood faded, and no sound remained in the conference room except the air conditioning moving through the ceiling vents. August Holloway released the edge of the table. He sat upright again. He didn't rise. He didn't look toward Meredith. He looked at Celeste Ashford, and when he spoke, his voice was that of a man asking the time at a train station. "Celeste, have you ever wondered why you've remained alive for the past 9 years?" She didn't answer. She was still standing with one hand braced against the table. August took the telephone from the pocket of his suit jacket. He placed it on the walnut surface, directly in the center, where all 12 people in the room could see the screen. He touched it twice. Then he turned on the speaker, and he said nothing more. He sat still with his gloved hands resting on his thighs. His eyes turned toward the bay beyond the glass, and allowed the ringing to fill the room. 1 ring. No one moved. Mrs. Orla Bennington tightened her hands around the silver head of her cane. Nettie Pryor stood against the glass wall, gripping the window ledge. Boyd Holloway looked down at the leather briefcase lying open on the floor. The 2nd ring. Celeste Ashford didn't move, but something crossed her face very quickly, something too swift for the human eye to catch. Then came a click, then the sound of an old man breathing, and a rough, slow voice emerged from the small speaker filling the conference room with its 3 glass walls on the 30th floor. "Is it done, Celeste?" Not one person in the room breathed out. 2 men on the board had gone pale. One of them raised a hand to loosen his tie. They both knew that voice. Everyone in the northeastern harbor knew that voice, and not one of them had heard it come from the speaker of a telephone inside a glass conference room in 20 years. August Holloway leaned very slightly toward the telephone. "Hello, Uncle Gideon," he said, his voice still as calm as though he were asking the time. "I'm sitting here with her. Is there anything you would like to say to her before I end the call?" 3 seconds. The clock on the wall marked them. 1, 2, 3. The call ended. The screen went dark. August Holloway leaned back in his chair. 9 years, Celeste, he said. And he couldn't say a single word to save you. Everyone in the room waited for her to scream. They waited for the handbag to sweep across the floor, for her fingernails to scrape the tabletop, for one of the performances of tears they had witnessed too many times inside the house on the cliffs. Celeste Ashford didn't scream. She removed her hand from the table. She slowly pulled back her chair and sat down. Then she lowered her head and looked at both hands resting in her lap. She turned the ring on her finger once, then stopped. "I was 19 when he found me," she said. No one interrupted. "My father had been dead for 5 weeks. He left me 4 empty safes and a house with foreclosure notices pasted across the door. I stood in my own living room while men carried my mother's piano through the front entrance, and I wasn't allowed to touch it one last time." She drew in a breath. Gideon Rook came the next day. He sat on the front steps with me. He didn't say he would pay my debts. He didn't say he would save the house. He only sat there and listened to me speak for 2 hours. She raised her eyes toward some point on the glass wall beyond everyone in the room. Then he stood. He put on his hat, and he told me that I was an intelligent girl. She stopped. That was the first time in my life anyone had ever said that to me. Inside the conference room on the 30th floor, no one answered. Mrs. Orla Bennington closed her eyes. Meredith Vale looked down at the table. Celeste Ashford remained still for 3 more seconds. Then she raised her head, and everything on her face had returned to what it had been before. Sharp, hard, wiped clean. "Don't look at me that way," she said. "I'm not apologizing to anyone. If I had the chance to begin again, I would do exactly the same thing." August Holloway stood. He drew the 2 sides of his suit jacket together and calmly fastened the top button with 2 gloved fingers. "About the baby," he said. Celeste Ashford looked up. "You said the state would take it." He looked down at the 2 sheets of paper still lying in the center of the walnut table. "You have 3 hours. During those 3 hours, my attorney will file a petition with this state's family court confirming me as the child's second legal guardian from the moment of birth. The petition will bear the mother's signature. It will include proof of financial support. It will include a lawful residence. He paused for one beat. After those 3 hours, if anyone wants to take that child away, they will have to take it from my hands. He didn't raise his voice on a single word. He walked behind his chair, placed both hands on its back, and looked around the room once. Now, he said, I believe it is time for us to discuss the will. The conference room door opened for the 5th time. No one knocked. A 37-year-old man entered wearing a long coat, and beneath it was the white hospital coat from St. Mercy that he hadn't yet had time to change. No one had invited him. Ward Price closed the door behind him. Ward Price stood at the far end of the conference room with his back against the door that had just closed. He didn't move forward. His name badge was still pinned to the chest of his white coat, the title printed in black letters, Chief Resident, Emergency Department, St. Mercy Hospital. He looked across the room, past 11 unfamiliar faces, past the woman in the red dress sitting motionless, past the elderly woman with the cane, until his eyes came to rest on Meredith Vale. No one invited me here, he said. But there are 2 things I have to say in front of everyone, and if I don't say them today, I never will. He took 3 steps forward. 7 months ago, I sat before this state's medical board. They asked whether I knew anything about the medication error in the emergency department at St. Mercy. I did. I knew very well. I had held that order in my own hands. He drew in a breath, and I testified that I knew nothing. No one in the room spoke. The second thing happened the day before yesterday. Ward Price turned his head. He looked toward the corner of the room where sunlight streamed through the glass, where a 72-year-old man sat motionless in a wheelchair, his head tilted slightly to the right, his eyes open. The day before yesterday, I saw my former wife again in the 4th-floor corridor. I saw that she was pregnant. I panicked. I didn't understand why I panicked, but I did, and I took out my telephone. He raised one hand and pinched the bridge of his nose. I called Celeste Ashford. I told her Meredith was living in August Halloway's house. Boyd Halloway's head snapped up. Celeste Ashford didn't move. I didn't know what I had just set in motion, Ward Price said. But I read the newspaper this morning, and I realized that because of that call, everything was moved forward by 2 days. One man paid the price for those 2 days. He looked directly at the wheelchair. I killed Mr. Crow. Meredith Vale rose from her chair. She bent down, lifted the old cloth case from beneath her feet and placed it on the walnut table. She opened the clasp. She removed a stack of medical files and laid them out one by one in a straight line across the table. 8 files. These are copies of the medical records of 8 patients admitted to St. Mercy Hospital during the past 3 years, she said. In all 8 files, there was a medication order containing an incorrect dosage. 7 of those 8 orders were discovered and stopped in time. She placed one finger on the first file. This file belongs to a 6-year-old boy. 7 months ago, a number was entered incorrectly on the screen. I didn't collect the medication. I called the pharmacist on duty. I called the attending physician. I stood in the corridor for 40 minutes, and during those 40 minutes, no one entered room 7. She paused. When everything had been corrected, I opened the door. The boy was coloring. A green dinosaur, with the crayon marks running far outside the lines. He said, I drew it for you, nurse. She lowered her eyes. He fell asleep before I left the room. He never knew anything had happened. All he remembered was that a nurse told him his dinosaur was the most beautiful one in the hospital. 3 men seated near the middle of the table had begun leaning forward. Meredith's hand moved along the wood, past the 2nd file, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th. It stopped at the final one. 7 people lived, she said. The 8th did not. She opened the file. Patient name, Rosalind Vale. Female, 58 years old, admitted with terminal cancer. The cause of death listed on her death certificate was multiple organ failure resulting from the underlying disease. She raised her head. My mother didn't die from cancer. Mrs. Orla Bennington lifted both hands to cover her mouth. 7 months ago, Meredith Vale said, after I stopped the medication order for room 7, someone asked me to go to the 9th floor. An empty conference room. The projector was still on. There were 2 glasses of water on the table, and no one drank from either one. The woman sitting across the 9-meter table pushed a sheet of paper over the wood. The paper stated that the undersigned admitted to changing the dosage in the medication order without authorization, accepted full responsibility, and voluntarily surrendered her professional license. In return, the hospital would pay the entire cost of treatment for a terminal cancer patient named Rosalind Vale. $400,000. Meredith Vale sat in that room for 40 minutes. The other woman said nothing more. She played with her telephone. At one point, she laughed softly at something on the screen. 40 minutes. Then Meredith picked up the pen and signed. She took the elevator down to the 3rd floor and entered the hospital room, where her mother was awake, sitting against the pillows and looking through the window at a maple tree changing color. "What happened to your face?" Rosalind Vale asked. "I was just promoted, Mother." "Promoted? To head nurse?" "Yes." Rosalind Vale laughed for 3 full minutes. She held her daughter's hand and laughed, and she said she had always known it would happen, that she was proud, that she wished she were strong enough to tell all her old friends in Coldbrook. 3 weeks later, Rosalind Vale died in room 312 at St. Mercy Hospital at 4:15 in the morning. The medication order from that night bore the signature of a member of the hospital's board of directors. In the conference room on the 30th floor, 12 people sat motionless. Celeste Ashford slowly raised her head. She looked at the woman standing across the walnut table, the woman in the gray sweater with her hair tied low and a 7-month pregnancy beneath it. And she spoke with complete honesty. "Who are you?" Everyone in the room heard every word. Meredith Vale stood straight. "I'm the woman who sat across from you for 40 minutes and signed her name in your place." She paused for one beat. "You don't remember my face." Celeste Ashford blinked. "I sign hundreds of documents every year." "I know," Meredith Vale said. "That is exactly what I wanted everyone in this room to hear." There was one more thing inside the old cloth case. Meredith Vale drew it out, a thick stack of papers held inside a blue folder, its edges curled from being pulled out and pushed back in too many times. Across the top of the cover was a printed title: "Complaint and Petition for Reconsideration submitted to the State Medical Board." Beneath it, every blank space had been filled in with her handwriting. She had completed those papers 7 months earlier, 3 days after her mother's funeral, sitting on the floor of a rented room with no heat. She had signed her name on the final page. Then she had placed it inside a drawer, and during the 7 months that followed, she had taken it out 9 times, and 9 times she had put it back. Because she knew exactly what would happen if the board reopened that case. They would discover that she had signed a confession admitting to an error she had never made. Under the laws of this state, that act had a name of its own: making a false statement before a professional licensing authority. It wasn't a matter of losing her license. It was a matter of going to court, and a woman under criminal investigation wouldn't be permitted to raise her own child while awaiting trial. She held the papers in both hands. 2 men in black suits were now standing at the conference room door, though no one knew when they had arrived. One of them wore the badge of the Regional Federal Prosecutor's Office. Elias Marchetti had called them at 6 o'clock that morning. Meredith Vale looked down at the folder. Then she raised her head and looked toward the corner of the room. There, beneath the sunlight slanting through the glass, a 72-year-old man sat in a wheelchair, dressed in an old gray suit, his tie neatly fastened, a thin blanket laid across his knees, his head tilted to the right. His eyes were open, directed toward the 9-meter table. Meredith Vale walked around the table. She approached the federal attorney standing at the door and placed the folder in his hands. "This is my petition for reconsideration," she said. "In it, I state that 7 months ago, I signed a confession accepting responsibility for an error I didn't commit in exchange for the hospital paying my mother's medical bills." The attorney looked down at the folder in his hands. "You understand what this means?" "I understand very clearly." She spoke the next sentence in an ordinary voice, without trembling or raising it. "I know this may send me to prison. I know I may not be allowed to hold my child during the first months of its life." The entire room was silent. "But there was an old man," Meredith Vale said, "who tapped 40 times with the only hand he could still move after someone promised him that if he tapped only twice, his daughter would be allowed to live peacefully for the rest of her life." She paused for one beat. "And I cannot continue living in this world if I'm more cowardly than he was." The federal attorney closed the folder and placed it inside his case. What followed happened very quickly, as things always did when everything had been prepared in advance. Elias Marchetti presented the 3 original documents and the 3-week-old will. The 8 pointed compasses were examined beneath a magnifying glass before all 11 members of the board. They played the 19-minute recording captured by a telephone hidden inside a nurse's apron pocket. Celeste Ashford didn't say a single word when she was told to stand. She only bent down, picked up her handbag, and walked out between the two men in black suits, her head held high, her heels striking the floor of the 30th story in the same 3-beat rhythm. Meredith had heard on the marble of the Holloway House Great Hall that afternoon. Boyd Holloway staggered. He tripped over his own leather briefcase, still lying open on the floor. The conference room door closed, and inside that room with 3 glass walls, all that remained were 11 men breathing heavily, an elderly woman with a cane, a 22-year-old girl leaning against the wall, a doctor in a white coat standing frozen at the far end of the room, and a man sitting motionless in a wheelchair in the corner. Meredith Vale walked toward him. She knelt before the wheelchair, both knees touching the floor, and placed her hands on the thin blanket covering his knees. "It is over, sir," she said. He didn't answer. She lifted her eyes to his face, his head still tilted to the right. His eyes remained open, still directed toward the 9-meter table, toward the place where everything had just happened. Meredith raised 2 fingers and placed them in the hollow of his neck, just beneath the line of his jaw. She held them there. She counted. She counted to 10. She shifted her fingers slightly. Then she began again. His skin had already grown cold. No one knew when he had gone. Perhaps 20 minutes earlier. Perhaps longer. Perhaps when the woman in the red dress pushed the 2 sheets of paper into the center of the table. Perhaps when the young woman named Vale rose and asked the entire room how many people there knew how to place 2 fingers against the throat of a dying man. He had sat there beneath the sunlight, slanting through the glass, so he could watch until the very end. And in that entire room, among 11 men who controlled the whole northeastern harbor, among tailored suits and watches worth more than a year of her wages, only one person knew how to check the pulse of a man who had already gone, the woman who wasn't permitted to practice medicine. Meredith Vale collapsed across his knees. She wept with both hands clutching the thin blanket, her forehead pressed against the cold back of his left hand, and no one in the room dared approach her. Then August Holloway walked the length of the walnut table, the man who had erased 3 warehouses in the South, with nothing more than a linen napkin folded into quarters. He knelt beside her. He placed one gloved hand on the shoulder of the man sitting in the wheelchair, and 34 years after the day he was born, for the first time in his life, August Holloway looked at the old butler and called him his true father. Gideon Rook wasn't in the conference room. People searched for him at his apartment in the suburbs, at the cafe where he sat every morning, and at the church where he had been building wooden pews since 1979. No one found him. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a crane operator at Pier Number 3 called the office and said that an old man had walked into the container yard at 11 that morning, carrying nothing, his hands empty, and that he had disappeared between 2 rows of steel containers without ever coming back out. The crane operator added that one of the container doors had been closed from the inside. Container number 47. August Holloway was standing beside the wheelchair in the conference room when he heard those words. He walked toward the door without saying anything to anyone. Elias Marchetti ran after him. Meredith Vale ran after him too, and when August turned and told her to stay behind, she looked at him once and didn't stop walking. Pier Number 3 stood at the end of the harbor road, where rows of containers were stacked 4 stories high, painted red, blue, and gray, stretching into the distance like a city without inhabitants. The July sun poured straight down. The concrete gave off a wavering layer of heat. The air smelled of hot paint, salt, and engine oil. Container number 47 stood in the outermost row beside the water. It was older than the others. Its paint had peeled away in patches. 4 long locking bars ran down the 2 steel doors, and 3 of the 4 had been turned into place from the inside. August Holloway stopped 5 paces away. He placed his gloved palm against the steel. He pulled it back immediately. "How hot?" Elias asked. 38 degrees outside, a dock worker said. Inside there, under this sun, it could reach 50 by sunset. August walked up to the door. Uncle Gideon, there was no answer. He struck the steel once with his palm. Uncle Gideon. Then a hoarse voice came from inside, slow and broken by the heat, yet still calm, the calmness of a man who had already completed every calculation. "You got here faster than I expected." August looked up at the roof of the steel container. "What is in there?" "Documents," Gideon Rook said. 30 years of documents. I've been gathering them here since spring. Names, amounts, dates, who owes me, who I owe. I've been sitting among them for 3 hours. Open the door. A dry laugh came from inside. Do you know what your father did to me in this very place 30 years ago? August didn't answer. He put me inside this exact container. He turned all 4 locking bars from the outside. He left me in here for 3 days. Meredith Vale stood farther back with both hands over her stomach. Sweat ran in streams down her forehead. I got out, Gideon Rook said. I pried one of the hinges loose with the buckle from my own belt. 3 days without water. I crawled out of here at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I swore to God I would take everything back. His voice fell lower. This time I don't intend to come out. August Holloway stood motionless beneath the sun. Then you already know how to get out, he said. There was no sound from inside for 10 seconds. Go away, boy. No, what are you going to do? Open the door and stand there, staring at me? Then what? I spend 15 years in prison and die in the infirmary. How is that any different? It is different. It isn't, Gideon Rook said, and this time his voice changed. It grew thin. For 32 years I had only one thing to do every morning when I opened my eyes. This morning I still had it. This afternoon it was gone. A paralyzed old man who couldn't speak took it from me with 36 taps. Elias Marchetti turned his face away. Leave the door where it is, Gideon said. You're Cassius Holloway's son. He would leave me in here to die. You will too. Blood is blood. August Holloway stepped toward the steel doors. He took the bolt cutters a dock worker handed him and cut through the 4th locking bar, the only one still secured from the outside. Then he pulled. The heavy door opened a crack, then swung wide, and the heat rushed out like the breath of an animal. Inside, among stacks of paper rising to chest height, a 62-year-old man sat on the steel floor with his back against the wall, his coarse cloth coat removed and draped across his knees. His silver hair was plastered to his forehead. He didn't look toward the opening. August Holloway stood at the threshold. He raised one hand and removed his left glove, then the right. He didn't fold them. He didn't place them anywhere. He threw them onto the concrete. Then he took one step into the darkness and extended his bare hand. Sunlight entered through the open doorway, enough to reveal that hand. It was covered in scars, old scars layered over scars even older. His knuckles had not yet fully healed from the night he struck the concrete wall in the basement of Holloway House. No gloves, nothing at all. Gideon Rook raised his head. My father would leave you in here, August Holloway said. He kept his hand suspended between them. I won't. For 30 years in the northeastern harbor, people had passed along 4 rules belonging to that man. Everyone knew the first 3 by heart. The 4th was never spoken aloud. It was simply understood that August Holloway never allowed his bare hands to touch anything he didn't want to remember. Gideon Rook stared at that hand for a very long time. He stared at it for so long that Meredith Vale had to turn her face away. Then he braced one hand against the hot steel floor and raised the other. And he took it. August Holloway pulled him to his feet, drew him out of container number 47, and caught him when his knees gave way on the concrete. People said that afternoon. Dozens of dock workers watched from a distance, and not one of them spoke a word. People said Mr. Holloway sat beneath the sun in the middle of pier number 3, holding the man who had destroyed his family for 30 years, and kept him in his arms until the ambulance arrived. The black leather gloves lay on the concrete 3 paces away. No one picked them up. That night, the 3 siblings sat in the study at Holloway House, with the brown leather notebook resting in the center of the desk. Meredith Vale unwound the leather cord wrapped around it 3 times. Inside, every page was crowded with handwriting, amounts of money, dates, abbreviated names, 32 years of one man recording the life of another. And tucked between 2 pages near the end was an unsealed envelope. No stamp, no address. Only one name written across the front in the slanting hand of another age. Rosalind. The date in the upper corner was from the autumn of the final year of Cassius Holloway's life. It had never been sent. Elias Marchetti opened it and read aloud. Because August couldn't bring himself to read it and Meredith didn't dare hold it. Rosalind. I traveled through 47 towns looking for you. I found you in 1998 in Coldbrook. I stood across the road for 3 hours. The little girl was playing in the yard. I didn't cross the street. Forgive me. Or don't. I understand both. Elias placed the paper on the walnut desk. Meredith Vale sat very still. In 1998, she had been 7 years old. She remembered that yard. She remembered the white painted wooden fence with the peeling paint. She remembered the road across from it, the only paved road in the entire town. And she remembered that on certain afternoons, she would look up and see a black car parked there. And she had never thought anything of it, because a 7-year-old child didn't think about cars parked across the road. August Holloway rose from his chair, took 3 steps, then stopped in the middle of the room. Then he sank to the floor with his back against the leg of the desk, and he cried. He cried aloud. He didn't raise a hand to cover his face. He didn't turn away. The sound of it rose toward the ceiling of the study, the sound of a man who had never done this once in 34 years and now didn't know how to stop. Elias Marchetti knelt on his left. Meredith Vale knelt on his right. The 3 of them remained on the study floor until morning. 2 days later, August Holloway summoned 11 men to Holloway House. They were the men who controlled the northeastern harbor, men whose names appeared in no newspaper and were absent from no important list. They took their places at the long dining table in the candlelit dining room, the very table where a man had once counted from 1 to 30. August sat at the head. Both hands rested on the wood. He wasn't wearing gloves. The 11 men looked at those hands, at the old scars layered over one another, and none of them dared look for long. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to the federal prosecutor's office myself," August said. "I'm taking the complete records of Holloway Maritime with me. 30 years, not one page missing, no one breathed. I'll serve 7 years." A man near the center of the table opened his mouth. August raised one finger. The man closed it again. "Elias Marchetti will sit in this chair. He is my brother." He allowed the silence to remain long enough for everyone in the room to understand that he had just spoken words that could never be taken back. "Anyone who touches him, I'll know, and I'll have 7 years alone in a room to decide what I'm going to do to that person." He placed both hands flat on the table. "There is one more thing. As of today, this harbor is clean. No contraband, no envelopes passed beneath tables. Nothing moves through Pier 3 without proper documents." He lifted his eyes and looked around the dining table. "Anyone who cannot live with that may stand and leave this room now." The candles burned. No one moved. Then a man seated near the far end pushed back his chair. He stood without looking at anyone and walked toward the door. The second man rose about 4 heartbeats later. August Holloway watched their backs until the door closed behind them. Then he turned toward the 9 men still seated, and he spoke in the same voice a man might use to read the weather report on the radio at 6 o'clock in the morning. "Those 2 men won't live to see the end of the month." In that candlelit dining room, no one else dared stand. His defense attorney was a 60-year-old man who had argued 23 federal cases and won 19 of them. He sat with August for 3 hours and placed a plea agreement on the table. 3 years, he said. "I can get you 3 years. You surrender voluntarily, you turn over all the evidence, and you cooperate fully. 3 years is the highest number I'll allow the prosecution to consider." August Holloway read the document from beginning to end. Then he pushed it back. "No, you don't understand. 7 years is 7 years. Your child will be in 2nd grade by the time you come home. I understand very clearly." He rose and walked to the window. "Last week, I sat at the head of a table and told 11 men that from now on, this harbor would be clean. If I serve 3 years, then for those 3 years, 300 men on the docks will understand that I purchased that cleanliness through a bargain." He turned around. 7 years is the right price. On the final evening, Elias Marchetti came to Holloway House. The 2 brothers sat on the veranda looking down at the bay. "I accept," Elias said. "I'll sit in that chair. I'll keep it clean. I'll hold it until the day you return." August nodded. Elias turned his wedding ring once around his finger. "But there is something I have to say today, and I'll say it only once." August waited. "My daughter is 4 years old. She carries the name of the man who raised me. Next week, she will have an uncle named Holloway, and for the rest of her life, she will hear people whisper that name behind her back." He looked toward the water. "I'll run your company. I'll eat dinner in that room. I'll sit at the head of that table." He turned toward August. "But I will never bring my daughter to this house." August Holloway remained silent for a very long time. Then he nodded. He understood. In the 34th week, Meredith Vale went into labor 6 weeks earlier than expected. The baby weighed 1.9 kilograms. They took her to the neonatal unit at St. Mercy Hospital. On the 5th floor, into a room where 12 incubators stood in 2 rows, and she lay in the 4th one from the window. 19 days. Every night, Exactly 10 o'clock, a 79-year-old woman with a cane entered the fifth-floor corridor, sat in the plastic chair beside the fourth incubator, and remained there until 2 o'clock in the morning. She brought nothing with her except a woolen blanket to cover her knees. The nurses on the night shift called her the unpaid night watch. No one dared tell her to go home. On the 12th night, at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, the alarm on the monitor beside the fourth incubator changed its tone. It was no longer the steady beeping that everyone on the fifth floor had grown accustomed to hearing for 12 nights. It became something else, higher and more urgent. Mrs. Orla Bennington rose from the plastic chair faster than anyone else in the room. She never told anyone what happened next. Only one young nurse, newly graduated, remembered that the old woman had spoken a sentence very softly, not to the baby, not to anyone in the room, but to something above the ceiling. Not this one. 40 seconds later, the alarm returned to its former rhythm. Mrs. Orla Bennington sat down, placed her aged hand against the side of the incubator, and didn't lift it until morning. The next day, when Meredith was brought in by wheelchair to visit her daughter, Mrs. Orla was still sitting there. She said nothing about the previous night. She only took something from her coat pocket and placed it in Meredith's lap. It was a brown envelope that had already been opened, the kind of envelope someone had slipped beneath Meredith's door at Holloway House before dawn, 3 weeks before the meeting. Inside it on that day had been 8 copies of medical records reproduced on a hospital machine. Meredith looked up at her. Mrs. Orla Bennington nodded once, very slightly. 36 years ago, I delivered your brother from your mother's body in a wooden house in Coldbrook, she said. 7 months ago, I was the person who signed your mother's death certificate on the 3rd floor of this building. I read her medical chart. I knew it wasn't the cancer. I owed the Vale family the truth, and I repaid that debt by slipping an envelope beneath a door at 4 o'clock in the morning. As for the 2 men who had risen from the dining table in the candlelit room that night, their story was told in many different ways throughout the northeastern harbor. The truth was that during the 4 weeks that followed, both men left the state of Rhode Island. One opened a small auto repair shop in Tampa and lived for another 20 years. No one knew where the other went. Neither man died, but to this day the entire harbor still believes they did, and that was the only thing August Holloway had ever needed. On his 9th day in federal prison, 3 men surrounded him in the yard. He was sitting on a stone bench, reading a letter. He didn't look up. 3 men, he said. The camera is in the left corner. You have 40 seconds before the guards arrive. 40 seconds isn't enough to kill me, but it is enough for me to remember all 3 of your faces. He folded the letter and placed it in his breast pocket, and I still have 6 years and 11 months left in here, he said. With you, they walked away. August Holloway took out the letter and continued reading. There was a photograph inside. A baby was sitting on a rug, holding a yellowed plastic wristband in one hand, and she was smiling. The man who had erased 3 warehouses, with nothing more than a linen napkin folded into quarters, sat alone on a stone bench in the middle of a prison yard, and he cried. The baby wasn't named Rosalind. That name belonged to a child who had never been given time to receive a name. Meredith Vale named her daughter Thea. She took it from the beginning of the name of a man who had tapped 40 times with the one hand he still had left. Holloway House was renamed Rosalind House. It became a free support center for medical workers whose professional licenses had been unjustly revoked. The medical board reopened Meredith Vale's case and formally recognized her as a whistleblower. She wasn't prosecuted. Her nursing license was restored the following spring, and she returned to St. Mercy Hospital, but not to the emergency department. She requested a position in the neonatal unit on the 5th floor. One September afternoon, Meredith Vale stood before Cassius Holloway's grave for the first time in her life. She brought no flowers. Elias Marchetti stood beside her, holding the baby in his arms. For 20 years, I placed flowers on the grave of someone I never knew, she said. My mother chose a random name carved into a headstone in the Coldbrook Cemetery so her daughter would have somewhere to cry. The wind moved through the rows of gravestones. I think you understand what that feels like, she continued. For 30 years, you also sent money to a name you didn't dare speak aloud. She bent down and placed the yellowed plastic newborn wristband on the face of the headstone. Your son is alive, she said. Both of them are, and your daughter is standing here. Wind from the Atlantic moved through the cemetery, and at that exact moment, near the gate, a A car came to a stop. A car door closed. Thea turned her head. Some people go through their entire lives without possessing anything of value, yet they preserve one thing no one can buy. A human being's dignity doesn't lie in the amount of money others are willing to pay them. It lies in the thing they refuse to sell. The truth remains the truth even when it arrives 30 years late, but the person who speaks it must always pay a price, and that price is what gives it value. And in this world, there are people who save the person they love most by letting go, a form of courage the world has never properly named. Please remember that a butler who cannot speak may still be the most honorable man in a room filled with powerful people, and a nurse whose license has been revoked may still be the only person who knows how to hold the hand of someone who is about to leave. A person's worth doesn't lie in the title printed on the badge pinned to their chest. If this story touched something within your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with the person you thought of while listening, so you won't miss the compelling stories still to come each day. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel. Which character will remain in your memory the longest? Which moment made you stop and sit in silence? Please leave a comment, even if it is only one line, because we sincerely want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. We wish everyone listening to this video lasting health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity every day. Thank you for staying with us until the final lines. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.